Beneath the crowns and coronations lies a stranger kingdom, one of royal love chairs, talking clocks, mango mishaps, and pet leopards parading through court. These aren't the tales in your history books. They're weirder, wilder, wonderfully undignified. This is the monarchy unstarched 101 bizarre but true stories about British kings and queens, where the scepters are silver, the scandals are scented, and the corgis have Christmas stockings. You thought royalty meant decorum? Think again. The throne has always had a wobble. Before we dive headfirst into powdered wigs and pineapple parades, make sure you subscribe to the channel because monarchs may come and go, but weird history is forever. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Let's see who's listening across the empire of the internet. Queen Elizabeth I's lead makeup. Queen Elizabeth I did not age, at least, not according to her face. As the decades ticked by and the Tudor throne wobbled beneath the weight of wars, rebellions, and the occasional assassination plot, Elizabeth remained in portraits, at least immortal, radiant. Ageless, white, unnaturally white. The secret behind her timeless glow? Poison. Specifically, Venetian ceruse, a luscious, satiny foundation made from white lead and vinegar, applied daily and thickly. It smoothed over smallpox scars, erased fatigue, and bleached her into an alabaster myth. Unfortunately, it also soaked through her skin, disrupted her nervous system, and slowly turned her into the most regal biohazard in England. But who needed health when you had image? By the later years of her reign, the Queen's mirror told a different truth than her subjects did. Her teeth were blackened, her hair fell out in patches. She refused to be seen without full face paint and elaborate wigs, even during illness. Her makeup, like her rule, was non-negotiable. And, like her rule, it was built on a very delicate surface tension. Physicians at the time politely avoided explaining that the makeup itself was killing her. Then again, they also believed sneezing expelled evil spirits, so perhaps they weren't the best consultants. Still, she endured, white as bone, perfectly still, slowly dissolving behind a mask she invented. Centuries later, her death is attributed to pneumonia, blood poisoning, or sheer stubbornness, maybe all three. But the image, the glowing marble face on coins, portraits, and propaganda outlived her, as if the paint was never meant to preserve her skin, but to prepare her for myth. And speaking of myths that don't breathe but still command the room, let's talk about the king who built a wine fountain just so no one would ever drink water again. Henry VIII's wine fountain. It's one thing to enjoy a glass of red with dinner. It's another to install an actual fountain that pours it on command. Welcome to Hampton Court, circa 1520, a place where the wine flowed like water, because water was frankly disgusting. Enter Henry VIII, a man of large appetites and even larger displays of overcompensation. As the King of England, he decided that nothing says divine right quite like plumbing that pours Bordeaux. So he commissioned a wine fountain, not for metaphor, not for occasional use, but as a permanent feature, a literal spout of alcohol for guests, courtiers, and wandering nobles to enjoy, for free. The fountain stood in the base court, the outer area where visitors gathered before entering the main palace. It was the Tudor version of popping champagne before letting anyone into your living room. Only, this champagne was room temperature, fermented, and vaguely medieval. Still, nobody complained. Free booze has a way of clouding judgment, which may explain several of Henry's marriages. The symbolism, of course, was thick as the vintage: abundance, generosity, power, but also spectacle. Henry didn't want to be loved. He wanted to be watched and remembered. Even if that memory was of a mildly intoxicated duke dribbling claret onto his codpiece. Records show the wine fountain flowed on special occasions, like royal births or visiting ambassadors, and was likely filled with claret or sack. It was less about refreshment, more about pageantry. One long, sticky performance of divine excess. And if you think that's odd, wait until you meet the king who walked through gardens, bowing politely to trees and expecting them to talk back. And while Henry's wine fountain was flowing and George III was out chatting with trees, let's take a quick pause. If you're enjoying this royal descent into the bizarre, don't forget to subscribe. There's plenty more strange splendor ahead, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you unraveling royal madness at 3 a.m.? Or sipping tea in the afternoon like a proper Victorian ghost? We want to know. George III, talking to trees. At some point in the early 1800s, King George III wandered the grounds of Kew Palace and began a conversation with an oak tree. This was not metaphorical, nor was it a drunken soliloquy. George, with court physicians trailing nervously behind, believed the tree was Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, and he was very glad to see him. He bowed, he smiled, he spoke. The tree, notably, did not reply, but that didn't seem to bother George. To the outside world, he was still, Your Majesty. To insiders, he was Farmer George, the eccentric monarch who preferred agricultural fairs to war cabinets and kept a detailed journal of cow breeding. But behind palace walls, his mind was melting into something far more mysterious than manure charts. George suffered from recurring episodes of mental illness, possibly linked to porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder. During these spells, his speech became manic, his thoughts circular, his temper unpredictable. He once wrote for 58 hours straight without pause. Another time, he foamed at the mouth while insisting that Hanover had turned into a vegetable. But the tree moment, that quiet chat with bark and branches, would become the most iconic snapshot of his unraveling, because there was something tragically polite about it. The king, alone with his hallucinations, still remembered to bow. It was easy for later historians to mock, yet even now, no one fully understands what George experienced in those episodes. Was it illness? Was it poisoning? Was it stress? Or was it something we still don't have the words for? What we do know, George III believed the world spoke back to him, and unlike most kings, he actually listened. But if you're looking for a monarch whose madness took a different turn, say, laying out her dead husband's clothes every morning for 40 years, we're just getting started. Queen Victoria's obsession with Albert's clothes. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria didn't just lose her husband. She lost the last person who told her when to stop working, when to take a walk, or when she was overreacting, which, for a monarch, is rarer than diamonds. What followed wasn't grief. It was a slow-motion haunting that she orchestrated herself. Each morning for the next 40 years until her own death, Albert's clothes were laid out, his shaving water was prepared, his breakfast tray was brought to the table, his rooms were dusted but never changed. A fresh towel, every day, hung untouched. She even had his chamber pot cleaned, just in case. Some called it devotion, others royal ritual, but up close, it looked more like a woman desperately trying to freeze time. Victoria was not known for emotional restraint. Her mourning became the monarchy's national aesthetic. She wore black for the rest of her life. Public ceremonies were reduced or cancelled. Her portraits became darker, more spectral. And the empire, sprawling and industrializing, watched a widow quietly wage war against the future. Courtiers whispered. Advisors sighed. Even her children grew frustrated. But no one dared stop her, because Victoria was not simply grieving. She was curating, managing the brand of eternal widowhood. Albert was dead, yes, but in her version, he was also perpetually running 5 minutes late. When she finally died in 1901, they found a lock of his hair, his dressing gown, and a plaster cast of his hand placed in her coffin. Say what you want about dysfunction, but she was committed. Still, not all royal eccentricities are born of grief. Some are, shall we say, more tactile, like the throne-loving playboy who had custom furniture made for his extracurriculars. Edward VII's custom love seat. Before he was king, Edward VII was Bertie, the rebellious, pleasure-hunting eldest son of Queen Victoria, who spent most of his life disappointing her simply by existing. Where Victoria mourned, Bertie mingled, loudly. Across Europe, he developed an appetite for heavy food, heavier women, and the heaviest furniture money could buy. Which brings us, delicately, to la chaise d'amour, the love chair. Crafted by a discreet Parisian furniture maker and housed in a private apartment at the famed brothel Le Chabanais, Edward's custom love seat was engineered like a royal carriage and upholstered like sin. Its purpose was mechanical to allow the portly prince to enjoy the company of two partners at once without, shall we say, too much cardiovascular strain. It featured handles, cushions, and a reinforced base designed to accommodate both his physical stature and his logistical preferences. This was not a one-time fling of furniture. The chair became part of royal lore, immortalized in whispered jokes and scandalous letters. Edward, weighing in at around 250 pounds at the time, was unapologetically practical about it. The throne of England could wait. This throne had better padding. And yet, the most outrageous part? After becoming king, Edward VII was arguably less scandalous. He cut down on indulgences, focused on diplomacy, smoothed over relations with France. He even begrudgingly wore suits that fit. But the memory of that chair lingers, part engineering marvel, part erotic artifact, part metaphor for the kind of monarchy that preferred silk sheets to statecraft. Still, some royals coped with confinement by leaning into earthly pleasures. Others brought their knitting. Mary, Queen of Scots, knitting. When you're imprisoned for 19 years in a series of cold English castles by your cousin, you have two choices: plot your escape or start knitting. Mary, Queen of Scots, did both, but only one was approved by the guards. Her needlework wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. From fine embroidery to stocking making, Mary stitched compulsively, hours at a time, days in a row. She decorated her cell with tapestries and hand-sewn emblems. She even embroidered symbolic images like thistles and crowned letters that subtly declared her royal claim, all while under constant surveillance. Imagine it, the would-be Queen of England, surrounded by needles and colored threads, quietly rebelling with every stitch. Guards may have seen a woman killing time. What they missed was the coded language of a monarch biding hers. Knitting became political. So did embroidery. Some believe her work contained veiled threats or messages to her supporters. Others think it was her way of controlling at least one thing in a life entirely scripted by others. Either way, it made her dangerous not just in the eyes of Elizabeth I, but in the eyes of history. Even in her final days, as her execution loomed, Mary stitched, carefully, deliberately. Her hands stayed busy, even when her fate was already sealed. The needle, it turns out, was her last form of power. But power, like royal taste, comes in many strange forms. Just ask the modern queen who ran an elite, pampered army of corgis. Elizabeth II's corgi army. If monarchs are known by their crowns, Elizabeth II was known by her corgis. A blur of short legs, royal collars, and relentless barking, they were the unofficial mascots of Buckingham Palace. At one point, the Queen had more than 30 of them, each with a personality, a pedigree, and a private menu. These were not pets. These were four-legged aristocrats. It all began in 1933 when King George VI, then Duke of York, brought home a corgi named Dookie. But it was Elizabeth who fell headlong into canine devotion. Her first personal corgi, Susan, accompanied her everywhere, including on her honeymoon. From that point forward, there was no turning back. The Queen bred her own line of royal corgis, each descended from Susan in what can only be described as a dynastic side quest. These dogs lived better than most humans. They had their own footmen. a dedicated room, monogrammed food bowls, daily menus that included fillets of steak, chicken, and liver, all approved by the royal chef and sometimes served on silver platters. When the queen traveled, the dogs came too, either by plane, train, or chauffeur-driven car. Once, a royal butler admitted he had to walk the corgis in matching pairs to avoid squabbles over hierarchy. But it wasn't just pomp. The queen genuinely adored them. She fed them herself, let them sit in her private quarters. They were said to have comforted her after Philip's death, barked through solemn ceremonies, and once bit a royal clockmaker on the ankle, diplomatically hushed, of course. They nipped, barked, and trotted their way into official portraits, and no matter how tense the state of the realm, the corgis remained. Like shaggy footnotes to history, loyal, loud, and low to the ground. And speaking of monarchs more interested in wool than war, let's discuss the sheep-obsessed king who couldn't care less about thrones, only lamb prices. Henry VI's love of sheep. Kings are expected to conquer. Henry VI preferred to count sheep, literally. Born into chaos and crowned as a baby, Henry spent most of his reign either losing territory or quietly retreating from reality. While his nobles schemed and armies bled out on French soil, Henry was often found in the countryside, peacefully discussing the comparative breeding value of Romney Marsh sheep. His idea of foreign policy? Asking if ewes in Normandy were any better than those in Kent. He wasn't stupid, just staggeringly uninterested in being a king. Rather than host war councils, he held agricultural discussions. Instead of commanding generals, he asked farmers about fleece quality. He was captivated by sermons, monasteries, and the moral lives of livestock. In a different century, he might have been a monk with a small herb garden and a sheepdog named Grace. Unfortunately, he was born into the 100 Years' War. When he did attempt to rule, it often backfired. He lost most of England's holdings in France, failed to keep order at home, and eventually spiraled into bouts of catatonic silence. During one episode, he reportedly didn't speak or move for over a year, and no, not even about sheep. Historians sometimes pity him, sometimes mock him, but there's something oddly noble about a man who saw the throne as less important than a good wool yield. Or perhaps he simply knew the truth. Kings rise and fall. Sheep are forever. But let's not get too pastoral. Next up is a royal who could turn a tropical fruit into political theater and make the nation stop and stare at a single prickly pineapple. Charles II's Pineapple Parade. In 17th century England, a pineapple was not just a fruit, it was a miracle. Imported from distant colonies, rare beyond belief, and as exotic as a parrot in a waistcoat. Enter Charles II, the swaggering Restoration-era monarch with a flair for the dramatic and a hunger for symbolism. Naturally, he used a pineapple to announce that the monarchy was not just back, but thriving. The moment came in a portrait. A court gardener presents the first pineapple grown in English soil to Charles II. The king gazes upon it like a celestial object. The gardener kneels. The fruit gleams. It's absurdly staged and entirely deliberate. Why a pineapple? Because nothing else screamed, "We're back, baby," quite like successfully growing a tropical delicacy in a land known for rain and root vegetables. The pineapple was hard to grow, expensive to import, and impossible to ignore. It was luxury incarnate. Owning one, even briefly, meant you had power, or at least that you could fake it convincingly. And Charles, ever the showman, understood that a pineapple could say what 1,000 proclamations couldn't. England was done with civil war and Puritan gloom. Fun was back, excess was in. Fruit was political. It's unclear whether the pineapple was actually grown in England or, more likely, imported and passed off as homegrown for the sake of the painting. But no one cared. The image stuck. The pineapple became a royal prop, a status symbol, even a borrowed centerpiece for wealthy dinner parties. Guests didn't eat it, they admired it, and returned it. But if you think that's strange, just wait until you hear about the queen accused of having 6 fingers and using them to cast spells. Anne Boleyn's sixth finger. Anne Boleyn was accused of many things: seduction, treason, witchcraft, but one of the most persistent rumors, that she had 6 fingers on one hand. According to her enemies, and she had many, Anne bore a small, malformed extra finger on her right hand, hidden under long sleeves and delicate gloves. A devil's mark, they said. Proof that she had bewitched Henry VIII. Proof that she was no true queen, but something darker, something unnatural. There's no surviving evidence that Anne actually had a 6th finger. Contemporary portraits show perfectly ordinary hands, and those closest to her never mentioned such a feature. But that's never stopped a good myth, especially one useful to her downfall. It's worth noting who was doing the talking: hostile ambassadors, political rivals, and jealous courtiers. The kind of people who measured women not by their merits, but by their anomalies. Anne was intelligent, witty, outspoken, all traits considered suspicious in a Tudor woman. So, when her enemies couldn't defeat her with diplomacy, they reached for superstition. In the panicked final days before her execution, stories swirled that her supposed deformities had been visible all along, hidden under silk, but always there, like guilt, waiting to be exposed. In reality, the rumors served a purpose: to dehumanize her. If she wasn't quite human, then the king wasn't quite a monster for destroying her. After her death, the image stuck. The 6th finger became shorthand for Anne's entire legacy: ambitious, seductive, dangerous. Even now, some biographies cautiously mention it, half believing. It's poetic, in a morbid way. A single phantom finger, possibly never real, pointing forever toward the cruelty of Tudor politics. And speaking of irrational fears and dangerous rumors, let's move on to a king who refused to be near anything sharp, especially if it had a blade. James I's fear of knives. Imagine being so afraid of sharp objects that you couldn't sit comfortably at a dinner table. That was King James I, a man who ruled over the unification of England and Scotland, translated the Bible, and yet couldn't handle the sight of a paring knife. James's fear of blades wasn't quirky. It was pathological. He believed someone, anyone, really could strike him at any time, so he banned the carrying of knives and swords in his presence. Even his own kitchen staff had to prepare food under strict surveillance. Forks were acceptable. Knives? Too medieval. Too stabby. It wasn't entirely without reason. James grew up surrounded by betrayal and conspiracy. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. He survived multiple kidnapping attempts. And then there was the gunpowder plot, the failed attempt to blow up Parliament, him included. So perhaps the fear wasn't irrational, just amplified. All the trauma of a threatened life, distilled into a horror of cutlery. His paranoia extended to assassination plots, both real and imagined. He believed in witches, omens, and coded messages. He wrote treatises on demonology, suspected satanic influence in politics, and once claimed that a storm that nearly sank his ship was summoned by sorcerers. And yet, despite all that, he was a scholar, thoughtful, curious, a patron of Shakespeare, the king who gave us the King James Bible. A walking contradiction, terrified and brilliant, obsessed with security, yet endlessly exposed. So, while others toasted with goblets raised high, James kept one eye on your belt to check for a blade. Which leads us to another monarch, obsessed with appearances not out of fear, but vanity. Prepare yourself for the tale of the corset-wearing king whose waistline was more carefully engineered than any military campaign. George IV's corsets. George IV was not built for subtlety. He was a king of extremes, extreme appetites, extreme fashion, and extremely uncomfortable clothing. At the height of his excess, his waistline ballooned to over 50 inches, but no matter, he simply squeezed himself into tighter and tighter corsets until he resembled a walking, wheezing hourglass. Unlike his father, George III, who preferred farming and astronomy, George IV liked mirrors and velvet, and extravagant uniforms that clung to his padded figure like gift wrap on a cannonball. Underneath all that silken embroidery was a body reshaped daily by the tyranny of lace-up corsetry. This wasn't a passing phase. George wore corsets most of his adult life. He took pride in the illusion. Tailors were sworn to secrecy. Servants were trained in the ritual of cinching. The man practically invented Photoshop, but in real life. Of course, the effect wasn't just physical. His vanity drove political decisions. He favored flattering portraits over honest advisors. He once delayed a meeting because his new breeches weren't ready. Diplomats waited. Fashion came first. And yet, for all his ridiculousness, there was something deeply human in it. He knew he was mocked. He knew his people resented his excess. The corset was part armor, part mask, a daily performance of control in a life that had spun wildly out of it. He died heavily in debt, massively overweight, and deeply unpopular, but his waistline, impeccably defined. So if you thought royalty meant freedom, think again. Sometimes it just means tighter laces. And speaking of odd royal choices, let's explore the queen who kept cereal in Tupperware because monarchy is no excuse for soggy cornflakes. Elizabeth II's Tupperware. If you imagined royal breakfasts involved solid gold bowls and caviar spoons delivered by footmen in powdered wigs, Queen Elizabeth II would like a quiet word, preferably over tea, served in fine china. But with cereal straight from Tupperware. Yes, Tupperware, the plastic kind. Snap-on lid, slightly foggy, the sort you find in a suburban kitchen next to the emergency biscuits and a magnet from Tenerife. Hers just happened to be kept inside Buckingham Palace. The Queen reportedly preferred her cereal, typically Special K or cornflakes, to be kept crisp, and she believed that the modern world had given her one true innovation, the airtight plastic container. At breakfast, staff would bring the Tupperware out on a silver tray, alongside bone china bowls and a pristine linen napkin. Royal dignity, with a gentle snap-lid twist. It's a scene worthy of satire, and yet it says something oddly comforting. For all her diamonds and decrees, Elizabeth II was deeply fond of routines. Not just any routines, her routines. She brought the same plastic containers to Balmoral, Sandringham, and Windsor. She even took her Tupperware with her on train journeys, wrapped and packed like a national treasure. And in a way, it was. Because the Queen understood something most rulers never grasp. Consistency is power. Whether dealing with Parliament or porridge, she liked things a certain way. Dependable. Sealed tight. No surprises. Of course, she also banned Monopoly from royal gatherings for being too vicious. But we'll get to that. First, let's pay a visit to a very different kind of royal morning one, where the king preferred the soothing wail of bagpipes as his alarm clock. Edward VIII's bagpipes alarm. Before he abdicated the throne for love, before he became the Duke of Windsor and left the monarchy in chaos, Edward VIII liked to be woken by a man in a kilt playing the bagpipes. No, really. While visiting Balmoral or other royal estates in Scotland, Edward adopted the long-standing tradition of the piper to the sovereign. But unlike most of his predecessors, who preferred bagpipes at official ceremonies or distant parades, Edward had them brought directly to his window at 9 a.m. sharp every morning. There he would lie in bed, curtains drawn, while a solitary piper paced beneath his window, blasting out traditional Highland tunes. A royal rooster, if you will. Loud, proud, and impossible to snooze. It wasn't just tradition. It was taste. Edward liked drama. He liked Scotland. And he liked starting the day like a conqueror from another century. It was less gentle awakening, more Gaelic war march before breakfast. The staff, naturally, tolerated it with gritted teeth. Guests, especially those unfamiliar with the Scottish arts, reported being startled, confused, or mildly terrified. Some thought there was an attack. Others assumed it was a prank. But Edward was delighted. This musical alarm became such a fixture of his routine that even after his abdication, he reportedly missed it, though, to be fair, not enough to stick around and keep the throne. The bagpipes, in a way, were a perfect metaphor for Edward VIII himself. Striking, hard to ignore, rooted in tradition, and slightly better in moderation. And if waking up to wailing pipes sounds odd, just wait until you hear about Queen Victoria's encounter with a mango and how she nearly ate it like a Granny Smith. Queen Victoria's mango confusion. The British Empire was vast. Queen Victoria, its living emblem, ruled over spices, colonies, and fruits she'd never seen. So when someone presented her with her first mango freshly imported, glistening with promise, she did what any proud, curious empress might do. She bit into it, skin and all. Like an apple? Witnesses reportedly watched in stunned silence. The queen, undeterred, chewed the tough outer peel with royal resolve before pausing and politely asking, "Is it supposed to be eaten this way?" It was not. But who was going to correct her? Who among her trembling entourage was going to tell the Empress of India that she'd just taken a full bite out of one of her dominion's most sacred fruits as if it were a crisp autumn apple? The mango was quickly whisked away. A servant sliced it properly. A new plate was offered. Victoria, to her credit, laughed, or at least smirked, and then continued on, unbothered. The moment became one of those quietly famous palace stories, not quite scandalous, not quite dignified, just human. The queen, as grand as her empire, fumbling her way through tropical fruit. But beyond the humor, there's something revealing here. Victoria ruled a world she rarely touched. She governed cultures she barely understood. The mango moment wasn't just culinary confusion, it was symbolic. A polite, leathery metaphor for colonial detachment. And yet, she tried. She tasted the empire, one bitter bite at a time. Coming up next, a king with a more literal taste in Pet's lions, to be specific, and an appetite for watching them tear into raw oxen at the Tower of London. Richard I's lion diet. Richard the Lionheart had a reputation to maintain, not just as a crusader, not just as a king, but as the kind of monarch who didn't just own lions, he fed them raw oxen at the Tower of London. Because if you're going to name yourself after a jungle predator, you might as well commit. The lions, of course, weren't native to England. They were diplomatic gifts, captured curiosities from the far ends of the empire, and deposited into the royal menagerie, a collection of exotic animals housed within the tower, where tourists and traders alike could stare at them in awe. Richard's contribution was more theatrical than zoological. A pair of lions fed publicly as a spectacle. The meat was dragged in, and the roar did the rest. It wasn't just showboating. The lions were an extension of Richard himself, fierce, unyielding, untamed. He was rarely in England during his reign, preferring the Crusades, where he earned glory, enemies, and a legendary status inflated by ballads and French poets. But when he was home, he made sure his presence and that of his feline avatars was impossible to ignore. Feeding lions massive quantities of raw meat wasn't exactly frugal, nor especially safe, but Richard wasn't aiming for practical. He was crafting legend. In an era when monarchy was part theater, part terror, what better symbol of dominance than a beast devouring an ox beside the king's fortress? And while many kings ruled with pens, laws, or religious decrees, Richard preferred claws, even if they weren't technically his. Speaking of unusual royal obsessions from roars to postage, let's turn to a king who ruled his own personal empire of stamps, one carefully catalogued and obsessively curated behind palace doors, George VI's stamp collection. Before he was king, before the war, before the stammering speeches and reluctant duty, George VI was just a man with a magnifying glass, poring over sheets of paper no larger than a thumb, stamps. Hundreds of them, thousands, each one a miniature story, a work of art, a fragment of empire. He began collecting as a child, encouraged by his father, George V. who, incidentally, was also a fanatical philatelist. Royal hobbies don't often pass down with such precision, but this one did. The Windsor stamp collection, begun in the Victorian era, grew under George VI's meticulous eye. He didn't just inherit it, he expanded it, curated it, and treated it like a living archive. While world leaders played poker with borders, George VI played chess with perforations. He collected errors, misprints, color shifts, double inking. He corresponded with experts. He stored his collection in climate-controlled albums at Buckingham Palace. Each page was turned with cotton-gloved care. Why stamps? Maybe it was the control, the precision, the quiet. For a man who famously dreaded public speaking, who had no desire for the throne and struggled to embody it, stamps offered structure. The king couldn't always control his nerves, but he could certainly organize his Fiji overprints. To this day, the Royal Philatelic Collection remains one of the largest and most valuable in the world. It's not just a hobby, it's a crown jewel in its own right. And speaking of jewels, not all royal accessories were diamond-studded. Some were horsehair and glue. Like the wig vault of a certain virgin queen who reinvented herself 80 times over one coiffed crisis at a time. Elizabeth I wig collection. By the time Elizabeth I was nearing the end of her reign, she had more wigs than friends, and possibly more wigs than functioning teeth. Over 80 inches total, ranging from coiled auburn masterpieces to powdered pyramids stacked with ornaments. Each one a new version of herself, queen, warrior, goddess, icon. They weren't just fashion, they were armor. As Elizabeth aged, her hair thinned dramatically, a combination of smallpox, scars, stress, and that delightful white lead makeup slowly trying to dissolve her. But no matter. Where nature faded, artifice triumphed. Her wigs were elaborate constructions, designed to cover every flaw, defy every rumor, and broadcast one very loud message: I am eternal. Each public appearance was choreographed like theater. The gowns, the pearls, the layers of paint, and atop it all the wig of the day. Curled and dyed to match her image as the Virgin Queen, they maintained the illusion of youth long after time had moved on. And the public? They believed it, or at least pretended to. Even ambassadors took note. One foreign envoy once commented that Elizabeth seemed more spirit than flesh, a floating vision of brocade, lace, and spun gold hair. In reality, she was likely sweating under several pounds of artificial glory, unable to move her neck, but determined to uphold the illusion. Her wigs became symbols of power, defiance, and denial. They were also, ironically, the most truthful part of her image, because unlike her titles or portraits, they admitted what she really needed to survive: artifice. And if you think that's extravagant, wait until you hear about the jousting accident that nearly took out Henry VIII and changed the course of his reign, and possibly his mind, forever. Henry VIII's jousting mishap. On the 24th of January 1536, Henry VIII mounted his armored horse for what was supposed to be a routine joust at Greenwich Palace. Instead, he wound up unconscious in the mud, not breathing, and possibly no longer the man he once was. The details are both theatrical and deeply Tudor. The king, in full armor, charged at his opponent, a younger, better jouster, and took a blow to the head that shattered his helmet. He was thrown violently to the ground, his massive body hitting with such force that he lay unmoving for 2 hours. Courtiers panicked. Physicians rushed in. Rumors whispered through the halls. The king was dead. He wasn't, but something had changed. After the fall, Henry was never quite the same. His mood darkened. His famous temper, already fierce, became volcanic. Once a dashing, musical, generous ruler, he transformed into the paranoid tyrant of legend. Some historians speculate he suffered a traumatic brain injury. Others think it merely accelerated what was already unraveling. Either way, the aftermath was catastrophic for everyone around him. That same year, Anne Boleyn fell from grace. Executions began to multiply. Henry's health deteriorated rapidly, and his once athletic frame ballooned. The court learned to tread lightly, to flatter obsessively, to fear his silences more than his rages. The fall from the horse became the fall of the man. It's poetic in a grim way. The king who imagined himself a warrior, unbreakable, laid low by his own sport, not in battle, not in rebellion, but in a jousting ring, trying to impress the court. And speaking of compensating for stature, let's now turn to a king whose legs were so short he needed fashion tricks to command respect. Charles I's tiny legs. Charles I was many things: devout, stubborn, misunderstood, but tall was not one of them. His legs, by all accounts, were noticeably short in proportion to his torso, so much so that portraits had to be corrected by painters to maintain royal dignity. In person, it was said that his padded clothing, high-heeled shoes, and extravagant capes weren't just fashion statements, they were camouflage, a carefully crafted illusion of vertical authority. It might seem trivial, but in the world of 17th century monarchy, height mattered. Kings were meant to loom. Charles did not. And so, with the help of tailors and painters, he built an image taller, stronger, more commanding than the man himself. The irony? Charles I was one of the most ideologically rigid monarchs in British history. He genuinely believed in the divine right of kings that monarchs answered only to God. And yet, he couldn't fully control how others perceived him. His body betrayed him, his portraits lied for him. But his reign wasn't toppled by inseam insecurities. It was torn apart by politics, civil war, and his refusal to compromise. Still, those tiny legs became symbolic of physical metaphor for a king whose foundation was never quite stable. When he was eventually tried and executed, many remarked on how composed he was, how regal, how brave. Even then, legend says he requested 2 shirts for the scaffold, not because of the cold, but to prevent shivering from being mistaken as fear. He controlled the narrative to the end. And if that sounds like a difficult legacy to live with, consider the woman who bore 17 pregnancies and watched almost all of them vanish into heartbreak. Queen Anne's dozens of pregnancies. Queen Anne was pregnant 17 times. Only one child lived past infancy. He died before his 12th birthday. That's not just a personal tragedy, that's a monarchy on the edge of extinction. A whole line of succession hanging by a thread that kept snapping. Anne's story is rarely told in full, maybe because it's so painfully repetitive. Pregnancy, hope, miscarriage, stillbirth, infant death, over and over again. Doctors blamed her weight, her health, her melancholy disposition. She blamed herself. Meanwhile, the court watched in silence, whispering behind fans and folding letters with urgent contingency plans. Through it all, Anne kept going, stoic, devout, and somehow still ruling. She was mocked for her appearance, dismissed by foreign diplomats, and painted as an emotional wreck. But she wasn't weak. She just lived in a time when female pain was private and royal suffering had to be decorative. Her surviving son, Prince William, was treated like a fragile national treasure cocooned in silk, guarded like a crown jewel. His death at age 11 wasn't just a personal blow. It caused a full-blown succession crisis that would reshape the monarchy and bring in the Hanoverians. Entire dynasties turned on the womb of one woman. Despite it all, Anne stayed on the throne. She kept governing, even as her body betrayed her. Her final years were spent in physical pain and emotional exhaustion, but she never abdicated. She just faded, like the line she failed to continue. And while some kings clung tightly to gold, Anne clung to candle ends, which brings us, neatly, to the next monarch, a man so frugal he reused everything, including his dignity, Henry VII's parsimony. Henry VII didn't rule with charisma, he ruled with accounting ledgers. After clawing his way to the throne at the end of the Wars of the Roses, Henry didn't just want to be king, he wanted to stay king. And staying king, in his view, meant one thing above all else: don't run out of money. Ever. He watched the crown's finances like a hawk in a counting house. Coins were tracked, wardrobes itemized, candles reused, royal robes patched and rehemmed until they looked more like costumes from a school play than the garb of a sovereign. Courtiers joked that he could stretch a farthing into a feast. Less a monarch, more a miser in ermine. But his penny-pinching wasn't just personal, it was policy. Henry introduced fines for everything. Noblemen who stepped out of line didn't face exile. They faced invoices. You could be charged for throwing too lavish a wedding or keeping too many servants. Disloyalty wasn't punished with swords, it was punished with spreadsheets. And it worked. By the time of his death, Henry had restored royal finances to something vaguely resembling solvency. The treasury was full. The crown stable. His son, Henry VIII, inherited not just power, but plenty of gold to squander. Still, behind the numbers was a man who never stopped watching his back. He distrusted people, hoarded wealth, and kept his court in a constant state of quiet tension. Even joy felt taxable. It's ironic. The founder of the Tudor dynasty is the least flamboyant of the lot. No scandals, no grand speeches, just a lifetime of receipts. And if you think that's dry, wait until you hear about the child king who couldn't stop betting on horse races and cockfights like a pint-sized Vegas high roller. Edward VI's gambling. Most child kings spend their reigns being manipulated by advisors, stuffed into velvet, and paraded about like ceremonial dolls. Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, had all of that, but with the unexpected twist of a betting habit that would make a bookie blush. Despite being just 9 years old when he took the throne, Edward quickly developed a keen interest in wagering. Horses, dice, cockfights. You name it, if it could move and lose, he was placing bets on it. And not copper coins either. We're talking sums that made the royal treasurers very nervous. Historians often focus on Edward's religious zealotry. He was a devout Protestant, wrote pious essays, and helped steer England toward the Reformation. But between the sermons and scripture, he loved the thrill of a gamble. It wasn't uncommon for the royal diary to include entries like, "Lost 10 shillings on a match," sandwiched between notes on state matters and theological observations. This wasn't just idle entertainment. Gambling was Edward's way of engaging with a world he otherwise had little control over. Surrounded by scheming nobles, protected from consequence, and burdened with expectations, betting offered a kind of agency, however superficial. The irony? Edward is often remembered as sickly and studious, pale, fragile, bookish, but beneath the scholarly veneer was a boy who liked risk, who wanted stakes, and who, despite the crown, craved unpredictability. Sadly, Edward's reign was short. He died at 15, likely from tuberculosis. But for a brief, strange window in English history, the holiest child in Christendom was also its most precocious gambler. And, speaking of royal etiquette, let's move from dice and cockfights to bananas and cutlery and the queen who refused to eat fruit like a commoner at a picnic. Queen Elizabeth II's banana etiquette. Imagine a stately breakfast at Buckingham Palace. Fine china, silver cutlery, a quiet hush of protocol. And in the middle of it all, Queen Elizabeth II, serenely eating a banana with a knife and fork. Yes, the monarch of the United Kingdom, defender of the faith, quietly slicing a banana into perfect, bite-sized pieces, spearing each one like it was an entree at a 5-star restaurant. No peeling, no mess, no indignity. To the Queen, it wasn't about being fussy. It was about not looking ridiculous. Like a monkey, she once allegedly quipped. And so, the fruit was subdued, elegant, proper, transformed from finger food into formal fare. It wasn't just bananas either. Elizabeth had a famously precise food etiquette. She avoided garlic, entirely banned from palace kitchens. Her sandwiches were cut just right. Her cereal, stored in Tupperware. And woe betide the chef who thought to serve her food in a manner unworthy of state-approved dignity. But the banana routine took on legendary status. It symbolized something deeper, a lifetime of restraint, a queen trained from childhood to never show emotion, never slip, never drop a crumb. Eating a banana by hand was just too human. The absurdity of it became part of her charm. It was both comical and impressive, the kind of quirk that made her feel distant and relatable all at once. Because while the rest of us fumble with peels on the go, she maintained royal composure down to the fruit course. And if you think that's the quirkiest thing about a monarch nicknamed Farmer George, you haven't heard about the king who would rather talk about pigs than politics. George III's farmer dreams. While revolution brewed in the American colonies and the storm clouds of modern Europe gathered, King George III was busy discussing crop rotation and cattle feed, and how to properly dig a ditch to drain a pasture. To the horror of his ministers and the delight of rural pamphlet writers, George wasn't much interested in conquest or court drama. What he really wanted was to be a farmer. Not symbolically, not just to project humility, but genuinely. He read agricultural journals, kept weather logs, and enthusiastically attended livestock shows. They called him Farmer George, half as an insult, half in disbelief. This was the monarch who lost America, and he was elbow-deep in manure, arguing over barley. At Windsor, he redesigned the royal estates to function like model farms. He employed the latest irrigation methods and proudly showed guests his prize cows. He wrote letters about sheep breeds with the same intensity other kings reserved for war reports. Even his personal library had more books about soil quality than foreign policy. And yet, beneath the eccentricity was something surprisingly visionary. George championed agricultural innovation during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. He saw farming not as backward tradition, but as the foundation of a modern Britain. He wanted farmers educated, land managed, resources preserved. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. His court often grumbled about his provincial fixations. Political tensions escalated, while George weighed the merits of different plow designs. The disconnect between the king's pastoral fantasies and the nation's unfolding crises widened and would eventually become tragic. Still, there's something disarmingly honest about a monarch who preferred tractors to treaties. And speaking of appetites for things sweet and deadly, let's return to the Tudor court and a queen whose teeth turned black from a very royal addiction, Elizabeth I's sweet tooth. Elizabeth I didn't just rule with brilliance and iron resolve, she ruled with sugar, buckets of it. Loaves, cakes, candied violets, marzipan swans, crystallized roses, sweetmeats carved into mythological creatures. The Tudor court was a Renaissance bakery with a political agenda, and at the center of it sat the queen, teeth rotting, smile dazzling, and sugar high enough to qualify as weaponized. To understand her obsession is to understand her image. Sugar was expensive, imported, rare. It signaled power, wealth, control of trade, the kind of status symbols no jeweled crown could fully convey. And Elizabeth, ever the master of optics, knew this. When she served sugar at banquets, it wasn't just dessert. It was diplomacy, performance, and silent declaration. But it came at a cost. Over time, her teeth darkened. Records from foreign diplomats describe her as sharp-tongued but black-toothed. Her famously pale complexion, aided by white lead makeup, made the contrast even starker. Still, she smiled, brazenly. The illusion was more important than the enamel. Elizabeth never married, never named a successor, never gave in to expectations. But she gave in to sugar daily. By her later years, it was said that she could barely chew solid food. Her meals were softened, her speech sometimes slurred, but her political mind remained razor-sharp. Today, the sweet tooth is often played for laughs, but at the time, it was a symbol of dominance. Only the wealthy could afford to ruin themselves so luxuriously. Her teeth weren't just damaged, they were proof of a sovereign who consumed the world and smiled through the decay. And if you thought that was indulgent, Just wait for the queen who filled her royal gardens, not with roses or lilies, but with oranges. A whole kingdom of citrus obsession awaits. Mary II's orange obsession. Mary II loved oranges. Not just the fruit, the idea of them, the shape, the smell, the gardens filled with their trees. They weren't a snack, they were an aesthetic. As queen, she surrounded herself with citrus like she was ruling from the Mediterranean rather than the grey drizzle of England. Her palaces boasted entire orangeries, grand glass conservatories, heated with coal furnaces just to keep the precious fruit alive. Gardeners were instructed to grow orange trees even when the climate insisted otherwise. If nature resisted, Mary insisted harder. It wasn't just personal taste. Oranges were fashionable among the elite. To have them was to have access, wealth, and a bit of stolen Sunday. But Mary took it further. She filled her gardens with them, painted them, gifted them, wore orange blossom motifs. The scent followed her like a signature. If Elizabeth I had her pearls, Mary II had her oranges. There was a deeper symbolism too. Oranges, with their layered rinds and fragrant oil, represented purity, fertility, even royalty in certain traditions. But mostly, they just made her happy. In a world of court politics and endless ceremony, the citrus groves were her sanctuary. Some historians have suggested that her obsession helped lay the groundwork for the rise of botanical collections in England, that her oranges, in all their pampered glory, were a precursor to the Victorian fern craze and the scientific gardens that followed. Others say she just liked the smell. Either way, her devotion was total. And it's a strangely soothing legacy, a queen remembered not for war or scandal, but for the stubborn hope of green leaves and sweet fruit under English clouds. Now, prepare yourself for something less fragrant. A king who smoked so much, his lungs probably thought he was a chimney. And yes, we're about to meet Edward VII. Edward VII's smoking habit. If you were to draw a cartoon of Edward VII, formerly Bertie, the perpetually disappointing heir to Queen Victoria, you'd start with a cigar. Always. Possibly two. One in hand, one waiting. Because if anything defined Edward's daily rhythm, it was the ritual of smoke. He reportedly puffed through 12 to 20 cigars a day. On top of that, several dozen cigarettes hand-rolled, high quality, and consumed with the practiced elegance of someone who had nothing left to prove. He was less a chain smoker and more a chimney in a top hat. Even his portraits seem to imply that, just outside the frame, there's a cloud of Havana haze lingering. This wasn't a rebellious habit picked up in dark alleys. It was an elite indulgence. His Parisian haunts were filled with smoke. His travel cases contained humidors. One valet was allegedly employed for the sole purpose of tending to his tobacco. No ash without honor. Naturally, doctors disapproved. Queen Victoria was horrified. And yet Edward carried on through diplomatic visits, opera nights, and early morning strategy sessions. Smoking, to him, was not just pleasure. It was identity, a social cue, a pause in the performance of monarchy. In an era increasingly aware of health risks, Edward's unapologetic devotion to smoking seems both dated and defiant. He lived in a time just before the consequences caught up, before public warnings, before lung x-rays, before the body began fighting back in headlines. But in his lifetime, cigars were not vices. They were accessories, power tools, the visible exhale of royal nonchalance. And yet, in all his smoky indulgence, Edward never quite crossed the line into cruelty. He simply enjoyed the excess, like any good royal trained to fill the vacuum left by centuries of actual responsibility. Coming up next, a queen who banned one of the world's most beloved board games, not for politics, but because it got too competitive. Elizabeth II's Monopoly ban. There are few things more terrifying than a game of Monopoly spiraling out of control. The glares, the fake money, the cries of, "You owe me rent," delivered with sudden familial venom. It's capitalism in cardboard form, and Queen Elizabeth II wanted no part of it. The story goes that during a family gathering, or perhaps during a charity event, Monopoly was banned from royal play. Why? Because, as Her Majesty allegedly said with a polite grimace, it became too vicious. That's not an exaggeration. The game's cutthroat mechanics have a reputation for turning friends into enemies. But in the tightly managed, optics-obsessed world of the British royal family, an evening that devolves into shouting over fake hotels on Mayfair isn't just embarrassing, it's a PR crisis. Elizabeth II wasn't known for banning much. She was famously hands-off in many personal areas, allowing her children to stumble through their own scandals like unsupervised aristocrats in a maze of bad decisions. But Monopoly? That was the line. It said the ban was soft, more tradition than law, but the symbolism was rich. A monarch whose empire once spanned the globe, quietly outlawing the game that turned imperialism into bedtime entertainment. You can imagine the irony wasn't lost on her. Even the idea of the Queen flipping a tiny table in frustration over a stack of plastic money is hilarious and somehow human. But that's the charm. Elizabeth was both mythical and maternal, regal and routine, capable of waving to millions one day and issuing a quiet board game ban the next. So while the rest of us fought over Park Place, the Queen politely declined to pass go. And now, let's undress things further literally with a story of a monarch who enjoyed dinner parties of a rather breezy variety. William IV's naked parties. Before he was king, William IV was a sailor. And while the sea may teach discipline and hierarchy, it also teaches a particular comfort with lack of clothing. That, perhaps, is how you end up with a monarch who allegedly hosted dinner parties where guests were encouraged to dine, how shall we say, without formal wear. These naked dinners, as whispered about in scandal sheets and court gossip, weren't necessarily orgies or Bacchic revels. They were, reportedly, just dinner with excellent food, fine wine, and very little in the way of fabric. Why? Well, William was never known for subtlety. As Duke of Clarence, he lived openly with his mistress, had 10 illegitimate children, and preferred honesty to elegance. The stiff formality of the court bored him. Protocol was a prison, so why not shed a few layers, or all of them? Whether these events were frequent or exaggerated by time remains debated. But the reputation stuck. William IV was seen as rough-edged, earthy, and erratically charming. The kind of king who'd misplace a speech but never miss a toast. His reign was short and politically volatile, marked by reform acts, street protests, and a Britain teetering on modern democracy. But behind the politics was a man still half seaman, half rogue, someone who looked at the monarchy and thought, what if we took the starch out, literally? In the end, his eccentricities were tolerated, even oddly appreciated. He was seen as a palate cleanser between the oppressive strictness of George III and the coming Victorian gloom. And speaking of Victoria, we now arrive at her first experience with industrial travel. A queen, a train, and the absolute terror of moving at 20 miles per hour. Victoria's first train ride. In 1842, Queen Victoria boarded a train for the first time. The iron beast, newly born of industrial ambition, was a roaring, clanking contradiction to the world of silk and candlelight she ruled. It promised speed, efficiency, and connectivity. It also terrified her. The train reached a dizzying 20 miles per hour. That's right, 20. And the Queen was horrified. To her, it felt less like travel and more like hurtling into chaos on rails barely thicker than her forearm. She clutched the sides of the carriage. She stared out the window with wide-eyed suspicion. The trees blurred. The countryside melted into abstraction. It was unnatural, too fast, an affront to the gentle pace of carriages and processions. But Victoria didn't protest. She endured. She was, above all, a woman of duty, and trains were the future. This ride from Slough to Paddington marked more than a novelty. It was a royal endorsement of progress. a statement that the crown would not be left behind by coal and steam. Still, the queen had her conditions. She demanded special carriages heavily cushioned, softly painted, reinforced to minimize noise. Tea service had to be possible at all times. A royal guard rode along. She was not about to risk being jostled like a common commuter. Later, she would come to enjoy train travel, even love it. But that first ride was a symbolic crossing. From the pastoral world of monarchs and manor houses to the industrial age, where steam replaced ceremony and everything moved just a little too fast. And while Victoria eventually adjusted, not all her royal relatives could handle discomfort so well, especially one monarch whose legs were wounded, but it was the smell that nearly drove his court to collapse. Henry VIII's leg ulcers. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the golden-haired prince who jousted, danced, and composed love songs. He was bloated, bitter, and wounded, quite literally. His legs, injured in previous accidents and aggravated by poor circulation, developed ulcers that refused to heal. They ached, they wept, and worst of all, they reeked. Now, to be clear, this wasn't whispered gossip. This was royal record. Courtiers complained of fainting. Physicians wrote detailed notes and letters that read like Gothic horror. Even his enemies, never shy with mockery, used it as proof that divine punishment had arrived via infected flesh. But the smell wasn't the worst part, the symbolism was. Henry, once the embodiment of virile monarchy, had become his own cautionary tale. The man who broke with Rome, created a new church, and married 6 women, was now a prisoner of his own body, wrapped in bandages and fury. He could barely walk, yet insisted on being carried to council. His once dazzling wardrobe was altered to accommodate his swollen frame. Elaborate chairs were commissioned so he could sit without pain. Everything around him became part of an unspoken choreography to avoid offending the royal senses or inhaling too deeply. And yet, through it all, he remained powerful, feared, obeyed. No one dared mention what was obvious. The king was rotting, in body and, perhaps, in conscience. Some historians see his physical decay as metaphor. The man who tore England apart to serve his will had begun to decompose before the work was even finished. Still, others in the family tree handled pain differently, even turned it into performance. Like the queen who didn't just master accents, she mimicked them for fun, to the shock and secret delight of her audience. Elizabeth II's mimicry. You wouldn't expect it from her. The hat, the gloves, the neutral tones. Queen Elizabeth II projected steadiness, solemnity, restraint. But behind closed doors, and sometimes even behind half-open ones, she had a secret talent: mimicry. She loved doing voices. Liverpudlian dock workers, Scottish grannies, posh debutantes, clipped military men. The queen could drop into character mid-conversation and, depending on the room, either delight or completely destabilize everyone present. It wasn't just playful, it was dead-on accurate. Courtiers, foreign diplomats, even family members found themselves lovingly impersonated by the monarch. Prince Philip reportedly encouraged it. Charles endured it. Staff would sometimes hear the Queen doing a startlingly perfect Australian accent after returning from a Commonwealth tour complete with slang. One of her favorite routines, insiders claimed, was imitating American tourists trying to spot the Queen without realizing they were speaking to her. "She looked just like the Queen," she'd say in a nasal twang, to peals of laughter from her entourage. This wasn't mockery. It was connection. Elizabeth, who spent most of her life being watched and almost never heard outside of scripted speeches, found in mimicry a kind of informal power. The ability to break the ice, to disarm, to remind everyone that behind the crown was a woman with ears and a sense of humor sharp as polished silver. It was also, in its own quiet way, resistance. A sovereign, locked into ceremonial stillness, choosing to rebel not with politics, but with perfect comic timing. Next up, a king with a sense of humor of his own, and a pet monkey dressed better than most of his courtiers. George IV's pet monkey. George IV never quite got the memo about moderation. Whether it was fashion, food, furniture, or flattery, he wanted more of it immediately, and preferably in velvet. So it should come as no surprise that the man who built the opulent onion-domed Brighton Pavilion also kept a monkey. Not just any monkey, a monkey dressed in miniature tailored suits, living the high life at Carlton House. The monkey, reportedly a capuchin, wasn't a background oddity. He was part of the scene, lounging about in royal apartments, perching on furniture, and occasionally interrupting conversations. Guests who visited the lavish residence were both charmed and confused, not because a monkey was present, but because it was dressed better than they were. George spared no expense. The monkey had its own wardrobe, often styled to match the prince's own ridiculous ensembles. Satin jackets, embroidered vests, tiny boots, all perfectly fitted and very likely more tasteful than George's own day wear. When you have a pet that doubles as a fashion critique, you lean in. But like many of George's indulgences, the monkey wasn't just about affection, it was performance, a statement. A living, capering metaphor for the Prince Regent himself, flamboyant, unpredictable, expensive, and undeniably memorable. His critics called him shallow, vain, a walking wardrobe with a crown. But George saw himself as a curator of experience, and that included his monkey. The creature became a strange emblem of his reign, charming and absurd, poised yet chaotic. And while most monarchs demanded obedience from their animals, George preferred admiration, even if it came from a small primate in custom-tailored trousers. Now, from pet monkeys to perfumed bathtubs, let's visit a queen who ditched water entirely in favor of wine and flower-scented soaks. Elizabeth I's perfume baths. Elizabeth I did not do anything by half measures. This included bathing, which, for her, meant skipping plain old water altogether and soaking in wine, rose petals, and exotic perfumes. Because if you're going to embody divine authority on earth, you might as well smell the part. Bathing was not a daily event in the 16th century. Hygiene routines were a far cry from the modern obsession with cleanliness, but Elizabeth turned it into performance art. Her soaks were ceremonial, part beauty ritual, part political branding. The scent of imported rosewater and rare spices filled her private chambers, signaling not just cleanliness, but otherness. She wasn't like other women. She was something closer to myth. The use of wine in the bath had a dual purpose: status and skincare. Red wine was thought to tighten the skin, and its alcohol content acted as a crude antiseptic. But mostly, it was expensive, frivolous, majestic. If her people thought their queen bathed in Bordeaux, well, that's exactly what she wanted. Elizabeth's perfumed baths were likely administered by a rotating cast of ladies-in-waiting, with everything from temperature to lighting managed to the queen's precise preference. She didn't just bathe, she curated the experience. And while others of her era might settle for a bowl and a rag, Elizabeth submerged herself in an aromatic fantasy, emerging each time as something renewed, not just cleansed, but re-anointed. It was political theater, soaked in lavender and mythology. And speaking of smells, let's now turn to a king who hated tobacco so much, he waged literary war on it with insults sharp enough to make your local smoker blush. James I's Tobacco War. James. I didn't just dislike tobacco, he despised it. Publicly, loudly, with a kind of eloquent rage only a Stuart monarch could summon. He wrote an entire essay denouncing smoking titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, which reads less like public health advice and more like a royal roast session. In the pamphlet, James called smoking a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. And that was just the opening. He accused smokers of behaving like barbarous savages, declared the habit a sinful and shameful vice, and implied that those who partook in it were morally and intellectually deficient. This was more than personal distaste. James saw tobacco as a foreign invader, a colonial corruption imported from the New World, symbolic of everything unruly and uncivilized. He despised how it made courtiers stink, how it turned refined spaces into smoke dens, and most of all, how popular it was becoming. The irony, of course, is that his own court was rapidly embracing the trend. Smoking had become fashionable, especially among young nobles trying to imitate the bravado of explorers and mercenaries. But James was not amused. He attempted to tax tobacco heavily, restrict its sale, and shame users through royal rhetoric. His counterblast stands today as one of history's earliest anti-smoking rants, passionate, sarcastic, and surprisingly modern in its health concerns. Yet, for all his words, he couldn't stop the tide. Tobacco became a national habit, then an economic pillar. James may have lost the war, but he won a strange sort of immortality as the first monarch to launch a moral crusade against something so everyday, so ordinary, and so defiantly smoky. Next, a queen haunted by a different sort of ghost, one that bloomed in her own imagination and her belly. Mary III's phantom pregnancies. Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, wanted one thing above all: a Catholic England and an heir to keep it that way. Unfortunately, her body had different plans. Or perhaps more tragically, no plan at all. In 1554, shortly after her politically strategic marriage to Philip of Spain, Mary joyfully announced that she was pregnant. Her stomach began to swell. Her appetite changed. Her physicians confirmed it. The royal nursery was prepared. Public prayers were held. England, so often poised on the edge of dynastic crisis, finally exhaled. But the baby never arrived. Weeks passed beyond the expected due date, then months. The court grew anxious. The swelling subsided. Eventually, the truth settled in. There had never been a child. The pregnancy had been entirely imaginary, psychosomatic, a royal illusion. This wasn't a one-time heartbreak. Mary experienced multiple phantom pregnancies, each time believing with unwavering certainty that she was carrying the future of her faith, her reign, her father's redemption. Each time, nothing came. The symptoms were real. The hope was real. The desperation, very real. But the outcome never changed. Historians still debate the causes. Was it psychological trauma from years of political isolation? Hormonal imbalances? A side effect of undiagnosed illness? Whatever the answer, Mary's phantom pregnancies became more than personal tragedies. They became national catastrophes. Because each false alarm further destabilized her fragile reign. Each child that failed to arrive opened the door wider for her Protestant sister, Elizabeth, and each moment of denial chipped away at her authority. In the end, Mary died childless and heartbroken. Her dream of a Catholic dynasty dissolved into history, leaving behind only whispers of what might have been and the unsettling power of the mind over the body. Now, from invisible children to racing birds, let's pivot to a queen who found deep satisfaction in training her pigeons for glory. Elizabeth II's pigeon racing. You don't expect to find Her Majesty the Queen hovering over a pigeon loft. But Elizabeth II, sovereign of one of the world's most watched thrones, had a very private passion: racing pigeons. Feathered, swift, and surprisingly competitive. The Royal Pigeon Racing Loft at Sandringham is not some dusty shed. It's a state-of-the-art facility, home to dozens of impeccably bred birds. And they're not just for show. These pigeons are trained, timed, tracked, and entered into national and international competitions. The Queen inherited the loft from her grandfather, George V, who was just as obsessed. It became one of her quiet constants, tucked between her more visible duties. You'd think pigeon racing might be beneath royal notice, but not so. Elizabeth funded the program, monitored its results, and took particular pride in its wartime legacy during World War II. Royal pigeons were used to carry vital messages for British intelligence. Some were even awarded medals for bravery. At competitions, her birds raced against commoners' pigeons, no royal shortcuts, no velvet perches, just wings and wind, and who got home first. The queen didn't bet on the outcomes, of course, but she did pay close attention. In many ways, the hobby suited her. Orderly, traditional, quiet. It also spoke to her sense of legacy. These birds weren't pets, they were heritage. Generations of winged descendants, serving the crown with silent determination. The pigeons, like their patron, flew under the radar until they didn't. And speaking of devoted animal lovers, let's flap over to a king whose preferred lap companions had long, silky ears and a breed named after him. Charles II's pet spaniels. Charles II had many passions: theater, chemistry, women, and mischief, but none followed him as loyally or as adorably as his spaniels. Specifically, the small, affectionate dogs that would later bear his name, the Cavalier King, Charles Spaniel. These weren't just palace pets. They were everywhere on Charles's lap during council meetings, in his chambers during court banquets, and sometimes even curled at his feet while he signed laws into effect. Diplomats often commented that the king seemed more relaxed around dogs than humans, and given the political chaos of Restoration England, who could blame him? The dogs were small, expressive, and fiercely devoted. Much like the monarch himself, they enjoyed lounging in decadent surroundings and preferred attention on demand. Charles was rarely seen without a furry entourage, which often accompanied him through palace corridors and even into formal ceremonies. One French ambassador, after an audience, complained that he wasn't sure whether he'd been dismissed by the king or his dog. Another remarked that the animals seemed to run the court as much as the ministers did, though they were, reportedly, far less treacherous. Charles's affection was so public and consistent that the breed became permanently linked to his reign. Centuries later, they still carry his name, fluffy reminders of a king who reigned during plague, fire, and political drama, but always made time for a belly rub. In the world of royal eccentricities, some gestures are grand, some ridiculous. Charles's was simple. In a palace of plots and masks, he found comfort in loyalty, the kind that wagged its tail and never asked for favors. And if you thought indulgence ended there, just wait until you see how Henry VIII approached dinner. Spoiler, it involved a lot of calories, and that was just the warm-up. Henry VIII's gluttony. Henry VIII's appetite was as legendary as his temper, and perhaps just as destructive. When most monarchs dined, it was a matter of formality. When Henry dined, it was theater, a political event. A royal performance with trenchers instead of scripts, and gravy instead of diplomacy. He consumed an estimated 5,000 calories a day, and that was before dessert. We're not talking light fare either. Think entire haunches of venison, roasted swan, suckling pigs, jellied eels, and pies stuffed with everything from rabbit to songbird. All served in elaborate banquets that made medieval feasts look like afternoon snacks. The kitchens at Hampton Court Palace were among the largest in Europe, staffed by over 200 cooks, bakers, and servers. They worked in shifts to keep pace with the king's relentless hunger. Wine flowed freely. Meat was boiled, baked, fried, and spiced to oblivion. Vegetables? Rarely. Fiber? A concept for peasants. But this wasn't just about taste, it was about power. Henry's table was a display of dominance, a signal that his kingdom, unlike his wives, was bountiful and obedient. Every extravagant dish whispered, "This is a man who wants for nothing." Of course, it caught up with him. By the end of his life, Henry was obese, plagued by health issues, and unable to move without assistance. His armor had to be custom fit and constantly upsized. Yet even then, the food kept coming. More courses, more servants, more denial. Historians often focus on his politics, his marriages, his schism with Rome. But behind every major decision was a man eating like tomorrow wasn't guaranteed and possibly trying to devour the stress before it devoured him. From gluttony to subtle gestures, let's turn to Elizabeth II, who may have spoken rarely in public, but always knew exactly where to put her handbag when it was time to leave. Elizabeth II's signal with handbags. In public, Queen Elizabeth II was the image of controlled poise, smiling, waving, listening politely while dignitaries droned on about topics she had already been briefed on weeks earlier. But behind the pearls and pageantry, Her Majesty wielded a secret weapon far more powerful than any scepter, her handbag. Observers of royal protocol quickly learned that when the Queen moved her handbag from one arm to the other, it wasn't an idle shift, it was code. A signal to her staff that she was ready to exit the conversation. A polite but firm digital SOS. Rescue the Queen, she's had enough. If she placed her handbag on the table, that meant dinner was over. Time to wrap it up. If she set it on the floor, a rare but serious gesture, it was a diplomatic fire alarm. Something was going wrong. Remove her immediately. Her staff, trained in these micro-signals, would swoop in with precision. A fake scheduling conflict, a gentle reminder about the next engagement. The Queen would smile, nod, and vanish like a very punctual magician with matching shoes. It's the kind of subtlety that defined Elizabeth's reign. No public outbursts, no direct confrontations, just quiet cues and carefully choreographed exits. Her handbag, a classic Launer London piece, wasn't just an accessory, it was a communication device wrapped in leather. People often asked what the Queen kept inside. The answer: reading glasses, a compact mirror, a mint or two. But the real contents were more abstract. Boundaries, control, and an escape plan that could be deployed without saying a word. Now let's shift from coded signals to bones under pavement, and the king whose centuries-lost remains turned up under something far less royal than a cathedral, a city parking lot. Richard III's skeleton found under parking lot. For centuries, Richard III's legacy was buried under layers of Tudor propaganda, and then, quite literally, under a parking lot in Leicester. It was one of the greatest historical plot twists in recent memory. The last Plantagenet king, found not in a grand tomb or ancient vault, but beneath Spot R in a council car park. The discovery in 2012 was the result of years of research, hope, and a bit of archaeological gambling. A group of historians and Ricardians, yes, they exist, believed that the Greyfriars Church, where Richard was reportedly buried after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, lay beneath modern Leicester. Specifically, under a municipal parking lot. They were right. What they found was astonishing. A skeleton with battle wounds, scoliosis curved spine, and DNA that matched living descendants of Richard's family. There he was, the king, portrayed by Shakespeare as a scheming hunchback, now reduced to bones and speculation. No crown, no ceremony, just asphalt, earth, and history's most awkward burial site. The discovery reignited debates. Was Richard really the villain the Tudors painted him to be? Or was he a reformer, undone by propaganda? Even in death, he stirred controversy, from where to rebury him eventually, to how to reassess his reign. His reappearance under modern infrastructure was a poetic punchline. A man once accused of burying princes in the Tower, himself buried under concrete and yellow lines. History has a cruel sense of humor. And if Richard III was found beneath a parking lot, our next royal eccentric found solace in something far less urban: the unlikely friendship between Queen Victoria and her beloved Highland servant. Victoria's pet Highland servant. Queen Victoria's grief was legendary, but her coping mechanisms were even more peculiar. After the death of Prince Albert, the Queen retreated into mourning black dresses, withdrawn public appearances, and a fortress of silence. Into that void stepped a tall, rugged Highland servant named John Brown, and from there, the rumors practically wrote themselves. John Brown wasn't a diplomat, a duke, or a man of letters. He was a gillie, a Scottish outdoorsman whose job had once been to escort the Queen on walks during her Balmoral visits. But after Albert's death, Brown's role grew. He became her personal attendant, her confidant, her shadow. He spoke to her plainly. He scolded her when necessary. He called her woman, not ma'am, and she didn't stop him. This was scandalous. The court bristled. Ministers whispered. Caricaturists had a field day. Mrs. Brown, they called her behind closed doors, a biting implication that the Queen's grief had turned romantic or, worse, domestic. But whether or not there was romance, and historians still argue over it, what's clear is that Brown gave Victoria something no one else could: honesty. While the palace swirled with protocol and empty flattery, he gave her grounding. He made her laugh. He gave her back a little control in a life otherwise consumed by ceremonial grief. When he died, Victoria was devastated. She had a statue of him erected. She kept his letters. She even requested he be buried near her. It wasn't love, perhaps, but it was something rare in royal history, a friendship too real to be safe. And speaking of royals stepping out of their comfort zones, let's look at Queen Elizabeth II's most unexpected stunt of all, jumping out of a helicopter with James Bond. Elizabeth II's James Bond cameo. The 2012 London Olympics opened with a global spectacle of British pride, music, pageantry, and, unexpectedly, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II parachuting out of a helicopter. Well, sort of. In one of the most surprising and dryly hilarious moments in modern royal history, Elizabeth starred in a short film with Daniel Craig's James Bond. The scene begins with 007 striding into Buckingham Palace to escort the Queen to the Olympic Stadium. With not a word, she rises from her desk, tosses on a pink ensemble, and marches alongside him to the waiting helicopter. Then, in front of billions of viewers, she leaps out of the helicopter, parachuting dramatically into the stadium as the crowd roared. The real Queen, of course, arrived moments later by more traditional means, but the message was clear. Elizabeth had a sense of humor sharper than any tuxedoed spy. What made the scene unforgettable wasn't the stunt itself. It was her willingness to be part of the joke. At 86 years old, the Queen poked fun at her own image. The stern grandmother of the Commonwealth, suddenly an action heroine, without saying a single line. It was also deeply British, understatement wit, absurdity treated as matter of fact. And it revealed something rarely seen, that Elizabeth, for all her stoicism, understood the power of modern storytelling. She knew how to surprise the public, and she knew when to lean into myth. No monarch had ever done anything quite like it, and no one likely ever will. Now let's pivot from mid-air antics to tree-bound escapes featuring a king who once avoided capture by literally climbing into an oak tree and staying very, very still. Charles II's escape in an oak tree. In 1651, after the disastrous Battle of Worcester, Charles II had a problem. He wasn't king anymore. He was a fugitive. Hunted by parliamentary forces, with a price on his head and no clear path home, he did what any quick-thinking monarch would do. He climbed a tree. The future king hid in an oak tree at Boscobel House in Shropshire, accompanied by a loyal supporter. Soldiers searched the area. They scoured the woods. They even passed directly underneath the tree, unaware that the man they were chasing was holding his breath in the branches above. It was a moment so absurd, so cinematic, that it felt like something from a fairy tale or a sitcom. A would-be king hiding like a schoolboy avoiding chores. But it worked. Charles remained still, quiet, invisible. Over the following weeks, he disguised himself as a farmhand, wore rough clothing, traveled by night, and narrowly escaped capture several times. He stayed in cottages, barns, even a priest hole. And yet, it was the oak tree that became legend. Years later, after being restored to the throne, Charles embraced the story. He turned the oak into national folklore. Royal Oak became the name of pubs, ships, and celebration days. The very idea that a monarch had once been reduced to hiding in a tree only made his survival more miraculous, more earned. It was humility by necessity, not choice, but it gave him a kind of groundedness rare in kings. He'd seen the underside of branches, he'd scraped bark, he knew what it meant to be desperate and lucky. Next, we journey from bark to Bordeaux, with a tale of royal disguises and secret cafe visits that would make any spy envious. Edward VII's Café Royal Visits. Before he was King Edward VII, he was simply Bertie, the endlessly restless Prince of Wales with a habit of slipping away from royal formality and into Parisian nightlife. Paris, to him, was more than a city. It was an escape hatch, a playground, a silk-draped whisper of everything his mother, Queen Victoria, disapproved of. And nowhere embodied that escape quite like the famed Café Royal. Known in France by the affectionate and slightly scandalous nickname Mr. Bertie, Edward would travel incognito, or as close to incognito as a future king in a custom suit could get to indulge in the city's late-night pleasures. These were not political trips. He wasn't there to discuss treaties. He was there for oysters, champagne, flirtation, and cigar smoke thick enough to carve. At the Café Royal and other elite haunts of the Belle Époque, Edward mingled with dancers, artists, aristocrats, and courtesans. He became fluent in charm, gossip, and the fine art of not getting caught. It was a kind of unofficial diplomacy. Britain's future monarch forging ties not through embassies, but banquets. Though everyone knew who he was, the game of pretending otherwise added a layer of theater. It allowed Edward to feel ordinary, or at least like an extraordinarily well-connected commoner. He wasn't flaunting power, he was dodging it. Back home, his reputation suffered. Critics saw a libertine, a man of appetite and excess, but the French adored him. And when he finally did become king, his long-standing friendships with French elites helped usher in the Entente Cordiale, a diplomatic thaw that shocked the skeptics. Turns out, a little late-night wine and whispered conversation can do what years of formal negotiations cannot. Now, from velvet lounges to secret devotionals, let's follow a queen who smuggled her faith into church with a book so small it fit in the palm of her jeweled hand. Elizabeth I's pocket-sized prayer book. Elizabeth I, master of appearances and mistress of narrative, knew that power often rested not in the loudest voice, but in the smallest, most subtle symbols. One of those symbols was her tiny, jewel-encrusted prayer book, small enough to fit in the glove or be worn like a pendant, yet powerful enough to send a message to an entire court. This wasn't just a devotional. It was a weapon of image-making. In an age when every gesture was political, Elizabeth carried this miniature book with her during religious ceremonies, council meetings, and even during court dances. Bound in velvet and set with gems, it was an object of fascination, more art than artifact. At a time when religious identity could get you imprisoned or worse, Elizabeth used her prayer book to walk the tightrope. It showed her piety, but also her independence. It wasn't imposed by Rome, nor dictated by her father's Church of England. It was hers, her version of faith, stylized and portable. She would be seen leafing through it in chapel, eyes cast downward, fingers delicately turning pages barely wider than a ring. But it wasn't the act of reading that mattered, it was the image. The Queen in solemn reflection, caught in a beam of candlelight, framed by stained glass and silent power. Even the size of the book spoke volumes. Compact, elegant, discreet. Like her rule, sharp without shouting. Surviving examples of these miniature books now sit behind glass in museums, their pages too delicate to turn. But in their time, they turned perception. Next up, a monarch with a far less poetic bodily function and a condition that left him leaking blue, baffling doctors, and muttering about madness and Prussia. George III's blue urine. If history had color-coded diagnoses, George III's would be tinted a very specific and very disturbing shade of blue. That's because, during some of his most notorious periods of mental and physical instability, his urine reportedly turned a striking bluish purple. Yes, really. This curious detail comes from 20th century medical hindsight, not from his 18th century doctors, who were more comfortable with leeches than laboratory science. But the blue urine would later become a key clue in a retroactive diagnosis of porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that may explain much of the so-called Mad King's erratic behavior. Porphyria can affect the nervous system, causing symptoms like confusion, paranoia, muscle pain, and, famously, urine that turns blue or purple when exposed to air. To the untrained eye of the Georgian court, it must have seemed like madness brewing from the inside out. But blue urine wasn't just a medical curiosity, it became a metaphor. A royal body that looked perfect on the outside, quietly unraveling from within. His rambling speeches, his long hours of writing, his infamous conversation with an oak tree, all suddenly recontextualized as the effects of a disease no one understood at the time. Even so, George had lucid periods. He loved astronomy, music, and farming. He was the monarch who lost America but gained surprising sympathy later in life. His condition, long treated as a cautionary tale of hereditary insanity, now looks more like a tragic case of misunderstood illness. And that strange blue tint? It may have been the only outward sign of the storm happening inside. Next, we look at a very different kind of royal exaggeration, the one worn in gleaming steel. Henry VIII's most infamous piece of armor, and the accessory no one could miss. Henry VIII's armor with codpiece. When it came to subtlety, Henry VIII was firmly on the side of not interested. And nowhere is this more evident than in one of his surviving suits of armor. A gleaming Renaissance masterpiece, complete with an aggressively oversized and entirely unnecessary codpiece. Now, codpieces in the 16th century weren't scandalous by themselves. They were a regular part of men's fashion, a sort of elaborate fabric pouch stitched onto the front of trousers, originally to accommodate the demands of layered clothing and evolving tailoring. But Henry's codpiece? That wasn't tailoring. That was a statement. Crafted not from cloth but from polished metal, his codpiece wasn't just exaggerated, it was theatrical. Bulbous, bulb-like, and perched right where the eye didn't want to look. It was designed to suggest virility, dominance, and the health of the Tudor dynasty, even when reality was much murkier on that front. Historians have long debated the motivation behind this metallic flourish. Was it an ironic joke? A symbol of royal potency? A deliberate act of intimidation? Possibly all three. After all, Henry was obsessed with legacy, and what better way to remind everyone of your dynastic potential than with a custom-forged groin plate? And yet, the irony lingers. The king who had 6 wives in search of a male heir, who executed 2 of them, and who fretted endlessly over succession turns out, his most famous armor may be compensating harder than his propagandists ever dared admit. The suit now resides in the Tower of London, where it continues to draw stunned stares and uncomfortable giggles. A relic of royal insecurity, forever frozen in steel. Next up, we transition from heavy armor to heavy eyelids as we revisit Queen Victoria's unexpected experiment with the strange new trend of hypnosis. Queen Victoria's hypnosis session. Of all the strange fads to flutter through 19th century aristocracy seances, phrenology, floral language, perhaps none was more bizarrely fashionable than hypnosis. And yes, even Queen Victoria, Empress of India and sovereign over 1/4 of the globe, gave it a try. It happened at Balmoral, her beloved Scottish retreat, sometime during the 1,840 seconds. The precise details are foggy as they often are, with royal experiments best left unconfirmed, but according to multiple accounts, the Queen allowed herself to be put into a light trance by one of the visiting doctors or medical entertainers dabbling in what was then called mesmerism. To clarify, this wasn't a swinging watch cluck like a chicken scenario. Victorian hypnosis was more about stillness, breath control, and something vaguely mystical. Practitioners claimed they could ease stress, relieve pain, even access the subconscious. For a queen weighed down by duty, mourning, and the endless machinery of state, the idea must have held appeal. Reportedly, Victoria remained composed throughout, if mildly amused. She didn't fall into deep trance, nor did she reveal any royal secrets, no confessions about Albert, no hidden state plots. But she did express interest in the calm it produced. Naturally, word leaked, and just as naturally, the press had a field day. Was it dangerous? Scandalous? Evidence that the Queen was under someone else's control? Of course not. But it made for excellent gossip. The monarch, eyes closed, drifting gently into the quiet void. She never repeated the experiment publicly. Like many Victorian amusements, it faded into the background of her increasingly ceremonial life. Still, the image lingers, the Queen of Restraint, voluntarily surrendering control even for a moment. Next, from altered states of consciousness to a very practical kind of power. Elizabeth II's private cash dispenser, hidden in plain sight within Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth II's own ATM. If you're imagining Queen Elizabeth II rummaging through her handbag for loose change, think again. At Buckingham Palace, behind doors lined with centuries of history and possibly a few corgis, sits something more modern and surprisingly mundane. A private ATM. Yes, an actual cash machine, installed by Coutts & Co., the exclusive bank used by the royal family and various other financial aristocrats. The ATM was placed discreetly in the palace to provide Her Majesty, and likely a few very senior staff, access to funds without stepping foot outside. The revelation came from royal insiders and occasional exposés that delighted in revealing the surprising ordinariness tucked behind royal opulence. After all, even a queen might need emergency pocket money. Of course, Elizabeth wasn't known for impulsive shopping sprees, nor did she likely use the ATM to fund last-minute midnight pizza orders. In fact, she reportedly preferred using cash only when necessary, and often for very specific personal transactions like giving church donations or tipping staff during holidays. But the ATM's presence itself was symbolic. It showed that while Elizabeth embraced tradition in public, she wasn't stuck in the past. Technology had a place even if it was dressed in marble and guarded by centuries of discretion. There's no word on what her PIN was, and frankly, no one wanted to ask. It's a curious juxtaposition, the ancient rituals of monarchy, balanced by the beep of an ATM and the gentle hum of modern convenience. And speaking of modern monarchy, our next stop takes us from private withdrawals to private punishments, with a gruff old king who believed in fines for swearing, even if his own royal temper wasn't exactly squeaky clean. George V's swear jar. George V didn't suffer fools, slackers, or sailors who forgot their manners, especially when those sailors were his own children. The king, known for his rigid discipline and gruff exterior, believed in order, propriety, and, surprisingly, the power of a swear jar. In the royal household, profanity wasn't just frowned upon, it was fined. A shilling per offense. No exceptions. Not even for princes. Especially not for princes. This royal swear jar wasn't a novelty item or a joke passed around during Christmas at Sandringham. It was serious policy. George V, a former naval officer, had served with men whose curses could probably melt ship paint. But once he became king, he expected decorum. That same sternness extended to his children, including Edward VIII and George VI, both of whom were known to test the limits of vocabulary and, as a result, their pocket change. If anyone slipped a word too spicy for Windsor ears, they were expected to drop a shilling into the royal pot. And while there's no official record of what the money was spent on, one imagines it went towards something fittingly austere, like new prayer books or a framed portrait of Queen Mary looking disappointed. It may sound quaint, but George V believed rules created character. His reign came at a time of political upheaval and war, and his approach to leadership was old school, direct, moralistic, and deeply invested in the optics of royal behavior. Ironically, the man who imposed fines for foul language was himself prone to outbursts. He was known to mutter darkly about politicians, palace bureaucracy, and the general state of the modern world, but never loud enough, it seems, to owe himself a shilling. From foul language to fast lanes next, we meet the queen who drove herself, license or not, and never once got pulled over for speeding through a royal estate. Elizabeth II's driving without license. Elizabeth II never needed a license to drive. Not because she was above the law, though technically she was, but because, as queen, she issued the licenses. It would have been a bit like signing her own permission slip. Still, the real surprise wasn't that she drove without a license. It's that she drove so often and so well. From her teenage years during World War II, Elizabeth trained as a mechanic and driver with the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She changed tires, tuned engines, drove ambulances. Long before she ever wore the crown, she was behind the wheel, sleeves rolled up, covered in grease, learning the fundamentals of internal combustion with military precision. That passion never faded. Throughout her life, she drove herself across her estates, Land Rovers through muddy fields, Jaguars around the Scottish countryside. She didn't need a chauffeur. She was the chauffeur. Guests who visited Balmoral or Sandringham were sometimes stunned to find the Queen herself pulling up to collect them. Foot on the gas, scarf in her hair, a corgi, possibly riding shotgun. And while protocol dictated that she could be driven anywhere, she preferred independence. It wasn't about breaking rules, it was about doing things properly, and sometimes that meant doing them herself. No license, no test, no traffic tickets, just decades of practice and a deep personal connection to the act of driving. And for a woman constantly surrounded by ceremony, paperwork, and armed security, the driver's seat was one of the few places she could be alone, unbothered, and entirely in control. From precision driving to less graceful games, we now return to Henry VIII and his personal tennis court, which smelled about as good as you'd expect for a king playing in armor. Henry VIII's stinking tennis court. Henry VIII played tennis like he did most things, with gusto, pageantry, and a complete disregard for practicality. One of his more curious royal projects was the construction of a private indoor tennis court. A status symbol for a monarch, yes, but also a questionable space filled with noise, sweat, and the lingering stench of Tudor enthusiasm. Built at Hampton Court, the tennis court was designed in the French style of jeu de paume, a kind of early racquetball meets ping-pong hybrid. But Henry didn't just build the court, he played in it. A lot, and often in full court regalia or even armor, depending on the occasion. The result? A spectacle of royal athleticism, yes, but also one that came with its own cloud of odor. Ventilation? Minimal. Cleanliness? Periodic at best. According to records, the court was known to smell strongly of sweat, stale clothing, and soiled straw, which lined the floor for cushioning. Henry, never one for moderation, would reportedly play for hours, perspiring profusely in the process, before retiring to devour half a roast animal. And yet, for all its funk, the tennis court was one of Henry's favorite places. It was where he could escape the burdens of kingship, pound a ball against a wall, and pretend, if only briefly, that no one was plotting his downfall or questioning his latest annulment. It's even believed he was playing tennis when Anne Boleyn was arrested. Royal gossip says he didn't stop the game. The court, incredibly, still exists at Hampton Court Palace and remains in use. A monument not only to Tudor sport, but to Tudor sweat. And next, we veer from sweaty pastimes to shimmering pageantry with a queen who loved costume so much, her life became one long, glittering mask. Anne of Denmark's masks. Anne of Denmark, queen consort to James I of England, didn't care much for politics, but she adored a good costume party. Specifically, She was obsessed with masks, elaborate court entertainments filled with music, dancing, and mythological symbolism, where aristocrats performed in lavish costumes before audiences that included the entire court and foreign dignitaries. Anne didn't just attend these spectacles. She starred in them. She commissioned them. She costumed herself as goddesses, nymphs, personifications of virtue, and once, rather boldly, Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice. Not exactly subtle, considering the court was whispering about favoritism and frivolous spending. Masks were the perfect playground for a queen like Anne, visually opulent, intellectually coded, and always towing the line between art and propaganda. They allowed her to shape her own image, powerful, divine, untouchable, while dancing in silver-threaded gowns that shimmered under torchlight. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Puritans, already nervous about anything fun, saw masks as moral decay with a lute. Taxpayers quietly seethed at the mounting bills for sequins, pearls, and imported silks. And James I? He mostly humored her, retreating to his books and letting his wife play goddess while he obsessed over theology. But Anne knew exactly what she was doing. These weren't just parties. They were statements, visual arguments about status, power, and presence in a court dominated by men with opinions and sharp quills. She may not have ruled directly, but she made sure people remembered how she looked while gliding across a stage. And speaking of royal obsessions that flapped rather than floated, let's dive into the chilly tale of George VI and his unexpected feathered fascination. Penguins. George VI's penguin obsession. George VI, the reluctant king thrust onto the throne after his brother abdicated, didn't exactly fit the mold of flamboyant monarchy. He was quiet, dutiful, chronically anxious. But in between speeches and state visits, he developed a strange and oddly charming fixation: penguins. Specifically, the penguins at the London Zoo. He first visited the zoo as a child and remained enchanted well into adulthood. Unlike the stiff rituals of court life, the penguins were delightfully unpredictable. They waddled with purpose but no obvious destination. They looked formal, yet acted ridiculous. Perhaps, in some subconscious way, he related. George would drop by the penguin enclosure during official and private visits, and his interest became well known among the zookeepers. He asked about breeding cycles. He donated to habitat improvements. There are even unconfirmed but persistent reports that he named a few of them. And it didn't stop there. He requested regular updates from the zoo, and reportedly chuckled at penguin-related cartoons clipped from newspapers. For a man who suffered from a debilitating stammer and carried the emotional weight of a nation at war, penguins waddling in tuxedos, unbothered by human expectations, were a kind of therapy. It wasn't just whimsy. It was escape. His daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, shared the fascination in their early years. Family photos from the 1,930 seconds show the royals peering into the penguin pit, utterly transfixed. And while the country braced for conflict, the king continued to find solace in the flightless birds who marched to no one's drum but their own. Next, we return to the more terrestrial side of royal quirks and Tupperware. Yes, again. This time, it's not cereal that's being stored, it's sandwiches for picnics by the Queen herself. Elizabeth II's Tupperware for picnics. If you imagine royal picnics involving gilded hampers, linen napkins, and an army of footmen laying out foie gras beneath an oak tree, Queen Elizabeth II would gently and efficiently correct you. Her picnics came with something far more practical: Tupperware. Specifically, plastic sandwich boxes. Despite living in castles, ruling realms, and receiving gifts from heads of state, Elizabeth remained remarkably grounded in her domestic habits. One of her most endearing quirks was her insistence on using reusable plastic containers, the same kind you'd find in suburban kitchen drawers, to pack sandwiches for her private outings. This wasn't a publicity stunt. She genuinely preferred it. When heading out for a countryside lunch at Balmoral or Sandringham, she'd have her simple sandwiches packed neatly into Tupperware, stacked and sealed, ready to go. No pomp, no gold-plated trays, just decades-old plastic that snapped shut with a satisfying click. The sandwiches themselves were famously plain: tuna and cucumber, egg and cress, ham with a touch of mustard. No royal chef needed, no caviar requested. And when asked why she still used such containers, the queen reportedly replied that they were quite sensible, which, in royal language, is high praise. These small habits offered a glimpse into the real Elizabeth, pragmatic, private, and utterly unbothered by extravagance in daily life. She knew the value of tradition, but also the virtue of a sandwich that didn't get squashed. So while her family's dinner parties might be spread across banqueting tables, her perfect lunch came in a neat plastic box, preferably outdoors, with the corgis circling like hopeful vultures. Up next, the extravagant breakfasts of George IV, a man whose morning appetite made even Henry VIII look restrained. George IV's giant breakfasts. If George IV had a royal motto, it may well have been, "Why eat one course when you can eat 7 before noon?" The man didn't simply dine. He feasted, even at breakfast, and his morning table looked more like the buffet at a medieval coronation than anything one might sensibly eat before lunch. His typical breakfast reportedly included multiple steaks, a pigeon or two, eggs, bread, and not one, but several glasses of champagne. All before the business of the day, which, to be fair, George often tried to avoid anyway. Diplomacy could wait, the pigeon was getting cold. This wasn't an occasional indulgence, it was a daily performance. At Carlton House or Brighton Pavilion, staff were instructed to prepare these enormous spreads regardless of whether he touched a bite. The king preferred options, and the abundance, like his wardrobe and furniture, was part of the royal spectacle. Physically, George suffered for it. His weight ballooned, his digestion rebelled. He wore corsets to keep everything in place, even as his breakfast table suggested the exact opposite of restraint. But no matter, he continued to eat, and order others to eat, as if volume equaled virtue. It was excess for excess's sake. Yet underneath the gravy boats and mounds of toast was a deeper truth. George IV was always trying to fill something, maybe not just his stomach, but a void of self-worth, legacy, or approval. Being king never quite satisfied him, so he turned to the plate. And speaking of collecting things with borderline obsessive flair, let's pivot to another monarch who couldn't stop amassing not jewels or titles, but teapots, hundreds of them. Because one cannot reign without the proper porcelain. Mary II's teapot collection. Mary II, co-sovereign with her husband William III, is often remembered for political compromise and Protestant stability. But behind palace walls, she had a quieter and far more ceramic obsession: teapots. She didn't just collect them, she adored them. She displayed them with curatorial care. And by the end of her reign, her collection had grown into the hundreds, featuring everything from blue and white Delft ware to Chinese porcelain, and early examples of English craftsmanship, trying very hard to imitate both. This wasn't just a passing fad. Tea culture was relatively new in England during Mary's time. Introduced as a fashionable indulgence among the elite, tea drinking carried social, political, and even moral overtones. By collecting teapots, Mary wasn't just curating pretty objects, she was investing in the future of British identity. She set the trend. Court ladies followed suit. Teapots became fashionable tokens of taste and refinement, displayed in salons and discussed in letters. Mary's interest even influenced trade policy, with increased importation of porcelain and attention paid to local potteries trying to perfect the art. But Mary's fascination wasn't just political or economic, it was also personal. She was known to walk her rooms late at night, checking on her porcelain displays, rearranging them, admiring their form and craftsmanship. Some described it as obsessive, others as deeply comforting. Her teapots were more than vessels, they were symbols of beauty, order, and control in a court that could be deeply chaotic. So, while William was off handling military campaigns, Mary was revolutionizing British tea culture, one dainty handle at a time. And if you thought collecting crockery was extravagant, let's now step into the perfumed gloves of a monarch who literally wore jewels on her hands and waved like a queen who could blind you with a single gesture. Elizabeth I's jeweled gloves. For Queen Elizabeth I, everything was messaging from the cut of her ruff to the angle of her wave. But perhaps no detail was more quietly dazzling than her gloves. Not just accessories, but weapons of seduction, power, and statecraft, and often encrusted with jewels. She owned dozens, possibly hundreds, of gloves made from the finest leathers, silks, and velvets, adorned with pearls, rubies, gold embroidery, and lace so delicate it practically whispered. Each pair served a purpose, some for ceremonies, some for court appearances, others for personal audiences where subtle hand movements could deliver not-so-subtle messages. Wearing jeweled gloves wasn't merely an aesthetic choice, it was a calculated display. Elizabeth was conscious of her hands as instruments of grace and power. When she extended one for a kiss, it wasn't just courtly affection, it was theater. A ring-studded, perfumed hand, descending like a divine relic. You kissed it, and in doing so, acknowledged everything she embodied: monarchy, mystery, and myth. She also gave gloves as gifts. These weren't trinkets. They were political artifacts, embedded with symbolism and scented with her favorite perfumes. To receive a glove from Elizabeth was to be chosen, favored, marked by her presence. Some recipients kept them for life, never daring to wear them. In portraits, Elizabeth's gloves often appear half removed, a deliberate pose showing both elegance and restraint, revealing just enough to remind everyone that even her fingertips were not of this world. Next, we descend from perfumed elegance to something far scruffier, a tiny monkey that liked to ride on a king's shoulder like a court jester with fur. Yes, Henry VIII had one of those too. Henry VIII's pet marmoset. Between beheadings, banquets, and building his own church, Henry VIII somehow found time for a more delicate diversion, a pet marmoset. Yes, the same monarch best remembered for his tyranny and thunderous appetites also had a tiny monkey perched on his shoulder, dressed in miniature attire, and reportedly behaving with more charm than most of his courtiers. Marmosets, small, wide-eyed monkeys native to South America, were exotic rarities in Tudor England. Owning one was the Renaissance equivalent of strolling around with a leopard on a leash. It screamed wealth, power, and global reach. But for Henry, it also served another purpose: entertainment and distraction. The marmoset reportedly accompanied the king during court appearances, perching like a furry ornament on his shoulder or clinging to his robes. Courtiers were expected to ignore it even when it scampered or squeaked. As always with Henry, if you laughed at the wrong moment, it could be the last thing you laughed at. The monkey, like so many of Henry's indulgences, was part of his larger obsession with spectacle. Everything had to be grand, unexpected, and unforgettable. Whether it was a gilded joust, a musical performance, or a dinner with 14 courses, the king made sure his court was never boring, and a monkey in miniature clothing was simply the next act. One can only imagine the confused expressions of visiting ambassadors as they tried to discuss naval treaties while a tiny primate picked at the king's sleeve. Henry's marmoset doesn't get much space in the history books, but it deserves a mention, not as a footnote, but as a perfect symbol of a monarch who wanted everything: war and song, love and loyalty, chaos and comedy. From celestial comedy to celestial curiosity next, we follow a king whose eyes turned upward, toward the heavens, building his own observatory and charting the stars. George III's astronomy hobby. George III is often reduced to the headline of the mad king who lost America, but tucked behind the dramatic footnotes of revolution and illness was a gentler, more curious man, one who looked up at the night sky and saw order where others saw chaos. At his palace in Kew, George built his very own astronomical observatory. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It wasn't even a vanity project. He genuinely loved science, especially astronomy, and he surrounded himself with the best instruments and minds of the era. Telescopes, celestial globes, brass fittings, his observatory had it all. He worked closely with the Astronomer Royal and attended demonstrations of planetary motion with the excitement of a boy given the keys to the universe. He funded expeditions, he read scientific journals, and when William Herschel discovered Uranus in 1781, George helped finance his continued work, even giving him a royal pension. Uranus, by the way, was almost named Georgium Sidus in his honor. Thankfully, the scientific community overruled that decision barely. George didn't just love looking at stars. He believed in what they represented: structure, reason, and order. In a world where politics were messy and his own mind increasingly unreliable, astronomy offered something solid, predictable, eternal. His interest also helped elevate Britain's scientific reputation. While France was busy with revolutions and philosophers, George's court quietly backed the empirical method, making space for science in a palace dominated by tradition. Of course, not everyone appreciated the king's celestial fixations. Some saw it as a distraction, others as an eccentricity. But perhaps it was simply the act of a man trying to make sense of the cosmos and himself. And now, from stars to cows, yes, cows. Because Elizabeth II didn't just rule the Commonwealth, she also had her own prized herd, grazing peacefully under royal protection. Elizabeth II's cows. It's easy to imagine Queen Elizabeth II as a monarch of marble palaces and high diplomacy, but at heart, she had a deep affection for the rural life, and nothing showed this more clearly than her personal herd of cows. Yes, cows. Not just any cows, of course. These were rare breeds, meticulously cared for and grazing the royal fields at Windsor. The Queen didn't just own them the way one owns a decorative title. She knew them. She inspected them. She took genuine pride in their breeding, lineage, and condition. The royal herd included red polls, Ayrshires, and Highland cattle, all part of an effort to preserve and promote heritage livestock at risk of fading into obscurity. It was Elizabeth's quiet campaign for agricultural conservation, carried out not through speeches or policy, but through pasture. Each cow had a name, a file, and, according to palace staff, a personality. The Queen attended shows. She kept up with their awards, and she reportedly insisted on receiving regular reports about the herd's well-being, as detailed as any prime ministerial briefing. For a woman raised in the highest echelons of ceremonial stiffness, Elizabeth's connection to animals was always refreshingly normal, but her cows weren't just pets. They were part of a broader vision, a way to tie the monarchy to the land, to stewardship, and to a quietly enduring sense of duty. In a world of protocol and pageantry, the Queen found comfort in mud, hay, and the simple act of watching a calf take its first steps on a foggy morning. Next, we move from the gentle lull of cattle to something rather dental and oddly personal. The Queen who wore a necklace made of her children's baby teeth. Queen Victoria's teeth necklace. Queen Victoria, the stoic Empress of India and mother of 9, was not known for sentimentality. Her public image was ironed flat black dresses, cold portraits, and a famously unamused expression. But behind that stern exterior was a woman capable of astonishing personal quirks. One of the oddest, she reportedly had a necklace made from her children's baby teeth. Yes, baby teeth. This peculiar piece of maternal jewelry wasn't an anomaly in Victorian England. Mourning jewelry, lockets of hair, and even brooches made from teeth weren't uncommon. But most examples were discreet, symbolic, perhaps tucked away in drawers. Victoria, however, kept her keepsakes close, sometimes uncomfortably so. The tooth necklace was part of a broader royal tradition of memorialization. Every milestone in her children's lives, from first curls to lost teeth, was preserved, categorized, and often transformed into objects. While some mothers might keep baby teeth in a box or drawer, Victoria wore hers, around her neck. It wasn't macabre to her, it was affectionate, a physical link to her children, whom she doted on obsessively in youth and controlled militantly in adulthood. For Victoria, family and legacy were indistinguishable. If those teeth had once belonged to future kings and queens, why shouldn't they be honored like crown jewels? The necklace became one of those royal oddities spoken of in hushed tones, too weird to ignore, too private to explain. But it captures a side of Victoria often forgotten, the mother, the mourner, the woman trying to hold on to fleeting moments in a life otherwise ruled by duty and death. And if you thought that was an unusual gift, just wait until you hear what Henry VIII once sent to woo Anne Boleyn. A giant codfish wrapped in silk. Henry VIII's codfish gift. Before he was slicing through marriages like a man on a mission, Henry VIII was a romantic, or at least his version of one. Long before Anne Boleyn lost her head, she received another, far less tragic gift from the king. A codfish, wrapped in silk, delivered with all the ceremony of a diplomatic envoy. Yes, a codfish, dressed like a present. This bizarre gesture was part of Henry's long, persistent courtship of Anne. At the time, she had refused to become his mistress. A bold and unusual stance in a court where resistance to royal attention was nearly impossible. Henry, both enraged and enchanted, doubled down on the wooing. Poems, letters, jewels, and, yes, seafood. The codfish in question wasn't just any fish. Salted and imported, it was considered a delicacy, a prized item during fasting periods when meat was forbidden. By wrapping it in fine silk, Henry turned it into a surreal blend of affection, status, and royal absurdity. A fish, but make it fashion. Anne, apparently, was amused, or perhaps bewildered. Either way, she didn't send it back, and Henry took that as encouragement. This wasn't just courtly flirtation. It was political theater. Anne's resistance and Henry's increasingly dramatic attempts to win her laid the foundation for the English Reformation. The fish, in all its absurd glory, is a symbol of just how sideways things can go when courtship gets entangled with policy. The gift says a lot about Henry. Lavish, theatrical, and not entirely self-aware. And it says even more about Anne, who played her part with masterful precision, knowing full well that sometimes the best power move is to accept the fish, smile sweetly, and say nothing. Next, we head from sea to sky, or at least the rooftops, with the king who awarded medals to pigeons for their service in wartime. George V's racing pigeons. George V didn't possess the flamboyance of his forebears, or the photogenic charm of his descendants, but he did have a deep affection for the unlikeliest of creatures, pigeons. Specifically, racing pigeons fast, feathered messengers who carried more than just news, they carried royal admiration. His interest began in the late 1800s and deepened throughout his reign. At Sandringham, he established a world-class pigeon loft, not just a hobby space, but a royal aviary, complete with records, training schedules, and daily routines. These weren't city pests. These were elite athletes with feathers. And George didn't just watch them, he studied them, he bred them, he understood their lineage, tracked their speed, and sometimes even released them himself. The pigeons bore royal crests and had names befitting a battalion. But their most dramatic role came during World War I, when the royal birds were enlisted for military service. Yes, enlisted. Several of George's pigeons were used to carry messages across enemy lines. With radios unreliable and communication lines frequently cut, pigeons became vital links between units. Their small size and high-flying speed made them perfect for covert delivery. Some flew hundreds of miles through gunfire and smoke, delivering critical intel that saved lives. In return, they were given medals, including the prestigious Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. George V was known to attend ceremonies, review their service records, and refer to them as trusted servants of the crown. It wasn't just sentiment, it was symbolism. In a world where kings were becoming ceremonial, George found real purpose in tiny wings. From skyward messengers to landbound engines next, we meet the queen who didn't just drive Land Rovers, she repaired them too. Elizabeth II's car maintenance. For a monarch whose public image was often defined by immaculately tailored coats, pearl necklaces, and rigid ceremony, Queen Elizabeth II had an oil-streaked secret. She loved fixing cars. Not riding in them, fixing them. With her own two hands, underneath the hood, sleeves rolled up and tools in hand. This wasn't some post-coronation hobby to pass the time between garden parties. Elizabeth was formally trained as a mechanic and driver during World War II. In 1945, at the age of 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service as Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor. And while her peers were still learning the finer points of afternoon tea, she was learning how to strip and rebuild a 6-cylinder engine. She changed tires, she handled trucks, she worked on ambulances, she got dirt under her nails. Wartime photographs show her beaming beside greasy engines and caked in dust, looking far happier than she ever did during a state dinner. And she didn't stop after the war. Throughout her life, Elizabeth retained a strong interest in vehicle maintenance. When staying at Balmoral or Sandringham, she would occasionally check under the hood of her Land Rovers, consult with royal mechanics, and sometimes correct them, not as a queen, but as a fellow gearhead. This love of machinery wasn't just about independence, though that was part of it. It was about competence, about knowing how things worked. In a world where so much of her life was ceremonial, Elizabeth valued the rare tasks that had tangible physical results. A spark plug tightened, a tire replaced, a vehicle she understood better than most people understood her. From oily engines to oiled mustaches, we now return to Edward VII, whose adventures in France earned him a nickname that no amount of royal dignity could ever quite scrub off: Edward the Caresser. Edward VII's Parisian nickname. Before he was King Edward VII, he was simply Bertie, and Bertie had a reputation that followed him through every club, court, and cafe in Europe. But nowhere was it more pronounced than in Paris, where he became so infamous for his charm and extracurricular activities that he earned the nickname Edward the Caresser. It was not meant sarcastically. While his mother, Queen Victoria, was embodying grief and moral rectitude back home, Edward was gallivanting through the French capital with a sense of entitlement and an entourage. Parisian high society, the salons, the opera houses, the courtesan circles welcomed him like a beloved rogue uncle who happened to be heir to the British Empire. He dined lavishly, smoked endlessly, drank enthusiastically, and socialized widely. His favorite haunts were the Café Anglais, Maxime's, and various private clubs where discretion was encouraged and reputation was negotiable. His manner was suave, his jokes crude but well-timed, and his preferences, well, detailed in private letters best left in sealed drawers. The nickname, Edward the Caresser, was coined with equal parts admiration and cheek. He was, after all, quite physically affectionate with friends, flings, and the furniture, judging by how many reinforced chairs he required. The French, unlike his British critics, didn't mind. They adored his flamboyance, his laughter, his willingness to be royal without being boring. And when he finally ascended the throne, many were surprised by how competent he turned out to be. The rogue had grown into a respectable monarch. But the nickname stuck, whispered with amusement in certain corners of Paris long after he wore the crown. From smoky salons to royal sleeves, let's now drop into a more curious image: Queen Elizabeth I, hiding a tiny mouse in her gown. Elizabeth I, pocket mouse. Elizabeth I didn't have children, but that didn't mean she lacked for unusual companions. Among the stranger rumors to trail the Virgin Queen through history is that she once kept a pet mouse, not in a cage, but in her pocket, tucked discreetly into the folds of her regal dress. Now, before we imagine rodent chaos in the Tudor court, let's be clear. This wasn't confirmed in the official records, but it was widely whispered among courtiers and captured in multiple sources close to her inner circle, and it fits the pattern of Elizabeth's deeply personal, often hidden affections. The mouse, according to lore, would travel with her during the day nestled in fabric, sometimes peeking out during long council meetings, occasionally fed crumbs under the table. Some claim it was white. Some say it wore a little ribbon. All agree it was not what anyone expected from a monarch who crafted her public image as a semi-divine, aloof icon in pearls and ruffs. But therein lies the brilliance of it. Elizabeth understood better than anyone that power is often about performance. And while her enemies painted her as cold and untouchable, those closest to her knew she was more complex, lonely, occasionally soft-hearted, and full of hidden quirks. The mouse may have been a private comfort, a secret rebellion against the stiffness of court life. In an era when women were expected to be either ornaments or threats, Elizabeth's mouse, if it truly existed, was a reminder that she was neither, or both. She ruled with steel, yes, but also with the quiet strangeness of someone who never let go of childhood wonders. Coming up, from hidden rodents to exotic architecture, we travel south to the seaside palace of George IV, who took a liking to domes, dragons, and opium-inspired dreams. George IV's love of Brighton. If George IV had been born 100 years later, he might have ended up as an interior designer with a reality show. Instead, he became king and used his immense royal budget to turn Brighton, a modest seaside town, into a surreal palace playground, and at the center of that fantasy stood his most bizarre creation, the Royal Pavilion. Imagine a palace built by someone who had seen an Indian temple in a dream, remembered none of the geography, but all of the glamour, and decided to build it anyway, on the English coast. That's the Pavilion. Minarets, onion domes, Chinese-inspired interiors, gold dragons curling around chandeliers, bamboo motif staircases next to mechanical palm trees. The place looked like someone had raided 3 continents and a wallpaper catalog. George didn't just design it, he obsessed over it. He micromanaged the architects, dined in its lavish banquet rooms, and received guests under ceilings painted with imaginary birds. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was escapism. Brighton was where he fled from court politics, from debt collectors, and, frankly, from his mother's disappointment. The pavilion became a monument to his contradictions. Physically massive yet emotionally fragile, opulent yet somehow insecure. It was here he played the role of exotic emperor, though never quite in control of his empire or his waistline. Local townspeople were baffled, Londoners gossiped, but George didn't care. He wanted spectacle, not approval. And Brighton, now a trendy city, still lives under the long, ornamental shadow of his bizarre vision. The pavilion stands like a mirage from another dimension, a king's daydream carved into stone. From imperial fantasy to spiritual visions, let's now turn to another king who heard not applause or criticism, but saints whispering directly in his ears. Henry VI's talking saints. If Henry VI was born into any other family, he might have lived quietly in a monastery, talking to statues and scribbling prayers in Latin, but he wasn't. He was born into the House of Lancaster, handed the crown as an infant, and placed atop a kingdom he never truly controlled, while claiming that saints spoke to him directly. Henry wasn't delusional, at least not in the classic sense. He was deeply pious, so much so that even by medieval standards, he was considered unusually withdrawn and spiritually fixated. While his predecessors drank, fought, and schemed, Henry spent long hours in private devotion. He built chapels, he founded Eton College, he walked barefoot on holy days. And yes, he heard voices. Accounts from his reign mention that Henry often claimed he received guidance from saints, particularly during moments of crisis. When others heard the clash of swords, Henry heard divine instruction. When civil war loomed, he prayed for visions instead of strategies. His court didn't know whether to revere him or panic. Many did both. To his supporters, he was a holy man unfairly trapped in the worldly mire of kingship. To his enemies, including the ambitious Yorkists, he was incompetent, passive, and, crucially, a liability. England burned while Henry lit candles. Eventually, His inability to govern led to his deposition twice. His visions didn't stop the Wars of the Roses, and they certainly didn't secure his legacy. But they made him an oddly tragic figure, a king who didn't want to rule, who sought guidance from the heavens while ignoring the rebellion forming on earth. From Whispers of Angels, we return to the racetrack and a queen who, beneath her crown, placed secret bets on her galloping favorites. Elizabeth II's horse betting. Queen Elizabeth II was the face of tradition, duty, and moderation. But when it came to horses, she had one deliciously unroyal habit. She placed secret bets. To the public, her love for horses was dignified. She bred them. She watched races. She handed out trophies. Her royal stables were world-class, and her knowledge of bloodlines, trainers, and track conditions could rival any veteran bookmaker. But privately, according to those close to her, the queen occasionally wagered real money modest sums, discreetly placed, usually on her own horses, never enough to make headlines. Just enough to enjoy the thrill. A secret flutter. A quiet rebellion in tweed and pearls. She followed the racing circuit with hawk-like attention. Trainers would receive handwritten notes congratulating them on minor victories. Grooms were asked about feed quality. If a royal thoroughbred placed badly, you could expect a polite but pointed inquiry by breakfast. Her horses competed at Royal Ascot, Newmarket, and Epsom, and she attended in full regalia hat, gloves, binoculars, and a racing form folded neatly in her handbag. Rumors swirled that she even had coded signals with her staff about odds and favorites. One flick of her program, and someone knew to keep an eye on horse #7. These weren't reckless bets. She knew the sport. She respected it. And like all things Elizabeth did, it came from a place of immense preparation and care. She wasn't gambling for money. She was participating in a world where her power was symbolic, but her instincts were razor sharp. So while others saw a figurehead, the betting slips told a different story. One of quiet competition, personal stakes, and a queen who liked to win. From fast horses to slow diets, our next royal went in a very different direction, living on grapefruit and vanity in equal measure. Enter Edward VIII. Edward VIII's diet fads. Edward VIII was many things dashing, controversial, ultimately abdicating, but he was also, in his own way, an early adopter of fad diets. Before wellness influencers and overpriced green smoothies, there was the Prince of Wales nibbling at a grapefruit-only breakfast, believing it would keep him slim, stylish, and camera-ready. He was obsessively concerned with his appearance, especially his weight. He believed that staying lean kept him youthful, and youth for Edward was currency. Even during his time as king, his morning routine included weighing himself, then adjusting his meals accordingly. And if that meant eating half a grapefruit and a black coffee while dreaming of roast beef, so be it. One of his most committed phases involved eliminating nearly everything from his diet except citrus fruit, dry toast, and very occasionally lean fish. He believed this regimen gave him energy and kept his profile already famously trim in ideal condition for the relentless public eye and, more importantly, photography. This was not a man aiming for balance or nutrition. It was image maintenance, aesthetic control. The same perfectionism that drove him to iron his shoelaces, yes, really, extended to every calorie he consumed. Courtiers found it exhausting. Chefs found it insulting. And Wallis Simpson, his eventual wife and fellow aesthetic perfectionist, reportedly encouraged the behavior, or at least tolerated it, sharing his interest in strict control and external polish. In the end, Edward's reign was short, but his grapefruit legacy long outlived his time on the throne. It remains one of the many small, strange details that sketch the portrait of a man who gave up a crown but never gave up trying to look good doing it. From citrus obsessions to spiritual toasts, we now raise a glass literally to James II and his unusual devotion to the Virgin Mary, one toast at a time. James II's Catholic toasts. James II ruled during a time when the religious tension in England could have been sliced with a communion wafer. He was a Catholic monarch in a deeply Protestant country, and he made little effort to hide his allegiance even in the drinking culture of the royal court. His insistence? That every glass raised be toasted to the Virgin Mary. This wasn't a one-time festive gesture. It was ritual, routine. Some called it obsessive. Others called it dangerous. In a court where every gesture was scrutinized for political meaning, James made his loyalties unmistakably and inconveniently clear. It didn't matter if it was wine, brandy, or ale. The king wanted every sip to honor the Mother of God, and he didn't shy from requesting others follow suit. Guests were caught off guard. Protestant nobles shifted uncomfortably. Ambassadors scribbled reports home. Some suspected it was less about piety and more about provocation. But to James, it was sincerity. He had converted openly and remained stubbornly devout despite mounting political fallout. His reign was a slow-motion crisis, with Parliament, the Church of England, and even his own daughter, the future Queen Mary II, inching away from his vision of a Catholic England. Toasts to the Virgin were just the visible bubbles in a larger pot. They weren't just prayers, they were statements. And every time someone raised a glass, James was forcing the court to choose, comply, or make a scene. Eventually, the whole kingdom chose the latter. James was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, replaced by his Protestant daughter and her Dutch husband. But in the annals of royal eccentricity, James's toasts remain uniquely sacramental, a nightly reminder that for some kings, the personal is always political. And speaking of painful personal choices, next up is Elizabeth I and her fight against toothaches without the benefit of anesthetic. Elizabeth I toothache cure. Elizabeth I had pearls sewn into her gowns, poetry written in her honor, and the fate of an empire in her hands, but none of that protected her from a toothache so fierce it made her cry out in public. And how did she treat it? The only way a 16th century monarch could, by having it drilled, without any form of anesthetic. The story goes that Elizabeth, whose legendary sweet tooth had finally caught up with her, began suffering from an excruciating molar. For days she paced the palace in discomfort, refusing to eat, speak at length, or attend state matters. Courtiers knew not to mention it, lest they be subjected to her famously withering stare, or worse, her silence. Dentistry in Tudor England was less science, more trauma. Tools resembled blacksmith instruments. Pain relief consisted of biting down on a strap of leather and praying for a short memory. The Queen, unsurprisingly, was hesitant, even terrified. And so, to prove the procedure was survivable, one of her bishops reportedly volunteered to have a healthy tooth pulled in front of her without flinching, a bizarre gesture of loyalty. Or perhaps an early example of peer pressure in the royal workplace. Eventually, Elizabeth relented. The tooth was drilled or extracted, records differ, and she endured it, reportedly gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her rings left imprints in the wood. Afterward, she wore high collars and kept her lips closed for portraits, revealing only minimal evidence of her dental struggles. But those close to her noted a subtle change. A little less laughter, a little more steel in her voice. Next, we shift from inner pain to outer appearances with George III's curious wardrobe choice, dressing like a humble farmer instead of a king. George III's farmer's clothes. When people think of King George III, they usually picture powdered wigs, polished shoes, and red-coated formality. But out at Windsor, away from the politics of London, the king occasionally indulged in a look that had less to do with regal splendor and more with the honest toil of English soil. He dressed like a farmer. Not metaphorically, literally. Peasant-style coat, wool trousers, mud on his boots. There are documented instances of George strolling through his estates, clad in rough-spun clothing and wide-brimmed hats, resembling a local yeoman more than the reigning monarch of a global empire. This wasn't a disguise or a performance. This was a choice, and a sincere one. The king had long held an affection for agriculture. He was nicknamed Farmer George, by both critics and admirers at first as a term of ridicule, but later as a mark of genuine respect. He encouraged innovation in crop rotation, invested in livestock breeding, and even maintained detailed records of harvests on his private farms. When other monarchs were acquiring jewels and territories, George was acquiring cows and plows. His rustic wardrobe was an extension of this identity. Dressing like a farmer let him blend in with the landowners and laborers he admired. It also gave him distance from the decadence and corruption of court life, which he deeply disliked. If the throne was a cage of gold, Windsor's fields were his escape tunnel. The public, once suspicious, came to appreciate it. There was something reassuring about a monarch who valued potatoes as much as policies. Especially during turbulent times, Farmer George looked like a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. From humble wool to royal sketchpads, our next monarch found her solace not in fields, but in funny little caricatures of the very men who governed her empire. Victoria's sketching hobby. Queen Victoria is rarely remembered as a woman of levity. The statues are stern, the portraits formal. But behind the heavy gowns and uncompromising stare was a queen with a surprisingly sharp and deeply private sense of humor. Her favorite outlet? Sketching. Not landscapes, not flowers, not idealized portraits. What Victoria truly loved to draw were caricatures usually of her own ministers, family members, or unfortunate visitors. And they were funny. Squished faces, exaggerated bellies, bushy eyebrows drawn like hedges, cabinet members transformed into goblins, generals reduced to marching potatoes in uniform. She drew with real skill. Her sketches were clean, expressive, and unmistakably satirical, and she kept them mostly to herself, compiling them into private albums that she would later review with a chuckle or a satisfied smirk. Occasionally, she'd share one with Albert, her husband, who was often the only other person allowed to laugh at them. In moments of high political tension, Victoria would retreat to her sketchbooks. It was a form of stress relief, a way of reclaiming some control in a world where every word she said became policy and every emotion she showed became news. By turning her frustrations into doodles, she let out steam in ink instead of anger. But her sketches weren't just jokes. They revealed how acutely she observed the people around her. She noticed slouches, smug grins, twitchy hands. She caught the essence of power not in what people said, but how they looked when they thought no one was watching. Today, a few of her drawings survive in royal archives, testaments to a queen who, despite the pomp, still delighted in poking fun at the serious men surrounding her. Next, we turn from sketchbooks to shipping forecasts, because Elizabeth II wasn't just a weather watcher, she was a subscriber. Elizabeth II's weather interest. Of all the subscriptions one might expect a monarch to keep: newspapers, intelligence briefings, maybe Vogue, Queen Elizabeth II had a favorite that was as uniquely British as it was deeply telling. The shipping forecast. Broadcast daily by the BBC, the shipping forecast is a hypnotic litany of meteorological conditions across the seas around the British Isles. With its poetic repetition and place names like Dogger, Fisher, and Rockall, it's the kind of thing most people hear while drifting off to sleep. For Elizabeth, it was essential listening. She didn't just enjoy it, she relied on it. According to palace insiders, she had transcripts delivered regularly and often tuned in live, especially while at Balmoral or Sandringham. To her, it wasn't just about weather. It was about connection to the land, to the sea, to her nation's maritime history. The Queen's lifelong affinity for the countryside and rural rhythms made her especially attuned to changes in weather patterns. She memorized cloud formations, she tracked seasonal shifts. Her diaries often referenced the sky, whether it was a hard frost or light winds from the west. The shipping forecast was the national heartbeat in audio form, and she listened like a farmer checking the skies before harvest. In a way, it fit perfectly with her personality, precise, constant, and deeply traditional. The voice of the shipping forecast never changed. Neither did she. More than just a royal quirk, it was a ritual of continuity, a daily reminder that even the Queen, with access to state secrets and satellites, preferred the steady rhythm of old-school maritime reports. And now, from weather charts to musical charts, we move back in time to a king who composed his own music and could strum a lute with as much flair as he wielded a sword. Let's revisit Henry VIII, the musical monarch. Henry VIII's musical skills. For a man so often remembered for executing wives, founding his own church, and eating like a banquet was a daily necessity, it's easy to forget that Henry VIII played music, and not poorly either. Before he became the heavyweight monarch of lore, Henry was a lute-strumming, organ-playing, hymn-composing Renaissance prince with a flair for rhythm and a genuine appreciation for melody. He wasn't merely dabbling. Henry received an elite education and trained in multiple instruments. He could sing, he could compose. He was skilled on the virginals, the recorder, and the harp. And most famously, he is believed to have penned several pieces of music, including the once popular Pastime with Good Company, a jaunty little number celebrating the joys of leisure, wine, and friendship. Irony, of course, would later follow that title like a grim little footman. But in his youth, music was Henry's outlet, his way of cultivating charm, courtly flair, and European respectability. He performed at feasts, he sponsored choirs. His court was filled with musicians, and he regularly brought in talent from across the continent to keep his ears entertained. Music was part of his political toolkit, but also, undeniably, a personal joy. And perhaps it offered him balance. The king who would later become a thunderous tyrant was, for a while, a romantic ideal. Handsome, athletic, musically gifted. Music softened his edges, until it didn't. As time wore on, the instruments gathered dust, the dancing ceased, and the music in court changed key from celebratory to ceremonial. But echoes of Henry's creative past still linger in the historical archives, where scores of his compositions survive, a strange but touching legacy from a monarch who once sang more than he shouted. Now, from late-night lute sessions, we swing toward even later nights with Charles II and his suspiciously nocturnal schedule. Charles II's sleep schedule. Charles II didn't like mornings. He didn't even pretend to. If the sun was rising, Charles was more likely to be ending his day than starting it. He routinely stayed up until 4 a.m., long after the royal halls had emptied and the candles should have gone out. His court wasn't so much a government as it was a late-night club with policy sprinkled in. This wasn't laziness, it was preference. Charles was a creature of the night. His most vibrant hours began when others were turning in. He dined late, held audiences after midnight, and was known to walk the palace corridors well into the early morning, deep in thought or in search of company. His bedchamber lights were rarely extinguished before dawn. Ministers dreaded nighttime summons. Foreign envoys scheduled meetings at midnight. If you wanted the king's attention, you'd better be a night owl, or at least a heavily caffeinated courtier. Why the odd schedule? Some say it was a habit picked up during his years in exile, when he lived a less structured, more indulgent life on the continent. Others say it was a form of psychological control, ruling his court on his own terms, in his own time zone. Whatever the reason, Charles ruled like a man allergic to sunlight. This nocturnal routine added to the louche glamour of his reign. His court became synonymous with libertine behavior, secret plots, candlelit dinners, and veiled gossip whispered through the corridors of Whitehall. Charles was always a step ahead, partly because he was awake while others slept. And speaking of creatures that come out when others don't next, we visit the queen who didn't just walk through her garden. She stopped to feed squirrels by hand. Elizabeth II's squirrel feeding. Elizabeth II may have been head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, and supreme governor of the Church of England, but none of those titles explain her soft spot for one of Britain's cheekiest little mammals. Squirrels. Not just a passing fondness, a full-on, nut-proffering, name-learning, hand-feeding type of relationship. The queen loved squirrels, especially the red ones, Britain's native species, now endangered and outnumbered by their brash American cousins, the greys. And she did her part to preserve them, both passively and personally. At Balmoral and Sandringham, staff were often surprised to find Her Majesty in the garden, crouched quietly, feeding nuts to the same few bold little visitors. Sometimes she'd name them. Sometimes she'd talk to them. And always she kept a stash of treats ready, tucked somewhere near the back door or in her coat pocket. Royal gamekeepers and footmen were instructed to protect the red squirrels, to monitor their health, and to discourage the gray ones politely, of course. The Queen was known to ask for updates. How's Cyril doing? Or did Nutkin come today? These weren't idle curiosities. These were regular check-ins, delivered with the same tone she might use to ask about foreign dignitaries. The press rarely picked up on this detail, perhaps because it seemed too quaint, too ordinary. But for those who knew her well, it was emblematic of Elizabeth's character. Steady, gentle, observant, and quietly loyal to the creatures who made no demands of her crown. In a world where everything was scheduled, squirrels came uninvited, and she welcomed them anyway. Next, we step back into another royal prison, not of duty, but literal captivity, where Mary, Queen of Scots, passed the time not with books or brooding, but with embroidery. Mary, Queen of Scots' embroidery. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent nearly 2 decades in captivity, and not the luxurious, velvet-lined version often assumed of royal prisoners. She was shuffled from castle to castle, tower to manor, always watched, never free. But rather than spiral into despair or worse, revolution, she picked up a needle and thread. And with those, she began sewing her story. Embroidery became Mary's rebellion, her creative outlet, her silent scream stitched in silks and golds. She didn't just make little roses or delicate birds. She sewed allegories, subtle, biting, veiled images that hinted at her thoughts on politics, religion, and power, all wrapped in the gentle innocence of tapestry. One of her most famous embroidered panels includes a cat and a mouse. The mouse wore a crown. The cat loomed above it. Historians have debated it endlessly, but many see it as a direct metaphor for Mary, the crown-bearing mouse, and her cousin, Elizabeth I, the looming cat, royal sass, disguised as stitching. She also sewed emblems of justice, broken chains, and exotic animals, all symbols that, in the hands of a skilled and dangerous woman, became tools of subtle protest. It was the kind of rebellion no guard could confiscate, no warden could punish, because after all, what harm could come from embroidery? But Mary wasn't just sewing for herself. She collaborated with Bess of Hardwicke, the wife of her jailer, on a series of elaborate tapestries now preserved in British museums. These weren't amateur needlepoint projects. They were politically loaded, spiritually dense, and artistically brilliant. Each stitch was a refusal to disappear. And from a queen's quiet resistance with thread, we leap back to another Tudor king, one who made court life a little more wild by parading around with a leopard, Henry VIII's pet leopard. Before Henry VIII became bloated, dangerous, and suspicious of anyone with a heartbeat, he was a golden-haired Renaissance prince with a taste for the exotic, and nothing screamed, "I am not like other monarchs," quite like owning a leopard. Yes, Henry VIII had a pet leopard, not metaphorical, not a nickname for a mistress. A literal big cat with spots, teeth, and a presence so menacing it made courtiers rethink their career choices. He paraded it around court sometimes on a leash, other times simply as part of his menagerie of strange animals meant to dazzle and disturb. It wasn't unheard of for monarchs to collect exotic beasts. Lions had long symbolized royal strength. Monkeys were amusing, parrots stylish. But a leopard? That was a power move, and a practical nightmare. Leopards are not known for their domestic manners. The animal likely lived at the Royal Menagerie in the Tower of London, a terrifying zoo of sorts, filled with gifts from foreign rulers who thought a rhinoceros or tiger was just the thing to impress a Tudor king. Henry's leopard was among these, and his favorite, according to some accounts. Having a leopard also gave Henry something other kings didn't have: fear. People were already intimidated by his size, his temper, and his increasingly unhinged policies. Add a predator to the mix, and you get a court where flattery wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. The leopard, of course, was less a pet and more a symbol of Henry's untouchability, his theatricality, and his flair for blurring the line between admiration and alarm. From teeth to tapestry to claws, we now slip into something even grander: a custom bed engineered not for rest, but for hosting more company than most guest lists allow. Edward VII is back, and this time he brought the furniture. Edward VII's giant bed. There are beds. And then there's Edward VII's bed in Paris, a legendary piece of furniture reportedly large enough to accommodate at least 4 people comfortably, possibly more, depending on the level of royal mischief involved. The bed was located in the famous Le Chabanais, a Parisian brothel that made Buckingham Palace look like a Sunday school. Edward, who traveled under the charming alias Mr. Bertie, was a regular guest. But he wasn't just dropping by. He had a custom bed built to his specifications: wide, sturdy, decorated with swans and gilded flourishes, and fitted with handles discreetly for support. It was a kind of anti-throne. Not a seat of power, but a platform of pleasure, and Edward made full use of it. The stories that survive are almost cartoonish. Champagne baths, velvet walls, waitstaff who knew his preferences by heart. It was debauchery wrapped in expensive sheets. And yet, back home, Edward managed to maintain his reputation as a genial diplomatic figure. His reign was surprisingly competent. He smoothed over international tensions. He modernized the monarchy. And all the while, he carried with him the charm of a man who knew both how to behave at court and how to misbehave anywhere else. The bed now survives as a relic of Belle Epoque excess, a symbol not only of royal indulgence, but of a time when kings could disappear into the shadows of another country and live like myth. And from the extravagantly horizontal to the diplomatically symbolic, our next monarch didn't rule with furniture, she ruled with gloves. Elizabeth I used them as gifts, weapons, and silent declarations of power. Elizabeth I's gloves diplomacy? In a court where every curtsy was a statement and every glance a gamble, Queen Elizabeth I wielded gloves like a general wielding swords. They weren't just accessories, they were signals, gifts, and sometimes warnings. Elizabeth had hundreds of gloves, embroidered, perfumed, bejeweled. Some were stitched with verses, others came in colors chosen for political significance. But what made them truly powerful was not how they looked, but how she used them. In Tudor politics, gift-giving was its own language, and Elizabeth spoke it fluently. When she offered gloves to a courtier or foreign envoy, it wasn't a gesture of warmth, it was a message. An elevated hand, a sign of favor. You had been touched quite literally by the Queen's approval. It might be temporary, of course. All of her affections were. But for a moment, you were lifted. She often gave gloves to ambassadors, particularly when negotiations were delicate. France, Spain, the Netherlands all received these fragrant tokens. They were subtle weapons in her arsenal of performative diplomacy. She would sometimes remove a glove in dramatic silence when displeased. That, too, spoke volumes. A gloved hand could bless or damn sometimes in the same week. And then there was the practical side. Gloves masked the effects of her famously lead-based makeup and covered signs of aging that could be seen as political weakness. To the end of her life, Elizabeth used her body, or the concealment of it, as a site of control. Today, many of her gloves survive in museums, fragile but telling. They are not relics of vanity, but of strategy. Each pair is a whispered negotiation, a royal poker face stitched in silk. From gloves as diplomacy, we now travel to the other end of fashion, a monarch who changed clothes 4 times a day and still wasn't satisfied. Welcome to the fashion fever dream of George IV. George IV's obsession with clothes. George IV wasn't content to just wear clothes. He consumed fashion, devoured it, redefined it, and in many cases, drowned in it. Where other kings dressed to rule, George dressed to be seen and then to be remembered. He changed outfits as often as he changed opinions, sometimes 4 or more times a day, depending on the event, the weather, or his mood. Morning coat, riding ensemble, hunting attire, dining waistcoat, evening regalia, and always something elaborate for lounging. Even his pajamas were rumored to have embroidery. This wasn't just vanity, though it was certainly that. George saw fashion as theater, and he cast himself as both lead actor and costume designer. He was Britain's first royal fashion influencer, long before social media made it a job title. He patronized tailors on Savile Row, obsessed over French cuts, and introduced new styles to England simply by walking into a room. And then, of course, there was the cost. By the time he was king, George had racked up staggering debts, much of it tied to his wardrobe. He once commissioned a suit woven from gold thread, only to decide he didn't like the way it shimmered in candlelight. Gone, replaced by something better, or shinier, or newer. Courtiers mocked him, satirists skewered him, and Parliament sighed loudly. But George didn't care. Because when he looked in the mirror, he saw not a flawed king or an extravagant debtor. He saw the most fashionable man in Europe, and for him, that was enough. From satin to sandwiches, the next royal moment is both bizarre and adorable. A monarch sharing a snack and a screen with a beloved animated bear. Elizabeth II's marmalade sandwich joke. In a career spanning more than 70 years, Queen Elizabeth II rarely strayed from tradition. But during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in 2022, she surprised the nation by sitting down for tea with Paddington Bear. The sketch opened like any royal engagement, polished, controlled, familiar. The Queen and Paddington sat opposite each other at Buckingham Palace. He was his usual, charmingly clumsy self, and she was smiling, genuinely. The setup was simple: tea, manners, chaos. But then came the marmalade sandwich moment. As Paddington offered her one from under his hat, the Queen responded with deadpan brilliance. "So do I. I keep mine in here." And with that, she pulled a marmalade sandwich from her handbag. It was funny, it was touching, and it was immediately iconic. The joke wasn't just a clever script, it was a piece of symbolic perfection. The Queen, known for her carefully unreadable expression and tightly curated public persona, had just revealed a secret whimsy. A lifelong monarch joking with a fictional bear over smushed citrus preserves. The British public loved it. The internet turned it into a meme storm. It wasn't just that the Queen had a sense of humor, it was witch humor. Dry, surreal, and thoroughly British. A marmalade sandwich as a national unifier? Only in Britain. More importantly, the skit humanized her. After decades of dignified detachment, here she was, playing along with Paddington like a mischievous grandmother, reminding the world that being sovereign didn't mean being solemn. And it was more than just a joke. Just a few months later, when the Queen passed away, thousands of mourners left marmalade sandwiches outside royal palaces. One quiet laugh had become a farewell. From tea with bears to chemicals in the basement, we now enter the strange lab of Charles II, a king with a passion for experimental science. Charles II's laboratory. When Charles II wasn't dancing until 4 a.m. or dodging assassination plots, he was often found in a place no one expected a king to be, his personal laboratory. Tucked into the Palace of Whitehall, the merry monarch became, in private, a surprisingly serious scientist. Charles wasn't just funding science, he was doing it. He mixed chemicals, he studied optics, he dabbled in alchemy and metallurgy. Visitors reported the distinct scent of sulfur wafting from the royal chambers. Not incense. Not perfume. Sulfur. His lab was part of a growing trend of scientific curiosity in Restoration England. But where other kings posed with telescopes, Charles rolled up his sleeves. He attended meetings of the Royal Society, granted it a royal charter, and even debated experimental findings. Some of the greatest minds of the era, including Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren, moved through his court. What was he hoping to find? Immortality? Gold? A cure for gout? Maybe. But Charles's motives weren't entirely mystical. He was a genuinely curious man, fascinated by the mechanics of the universe and the limits of human knowledge. A monarch by birth, but a tinkerer at heart. His scientific dabbling also served a political purpose. Post-Civil War, England needed a king who seemed forward-looking, modern, and interested in more than just lineage. Charles's interest in science gave him intellectual credibility and a bit of mystique. One legend has him watching the weather from his rooftop, collecting data like an amateur meteorologist. Another shows him dissecting animals. The truth, somewhere in between. From beakers and blueprints to bridles and braying, we now return to Queen Victoria, who despite commanding half the globe, still found joy riding donkeys in the Scottish Highlands. Queen Victoria's donkey rides. For all her stern reputation and imperial authority, Queen Victoria had a surprisingly soft spot for donkeys, not just as royal pets or farmyard curiosities, but as actual transport. When she stayed at Balmoral or Osborne House, she was frequently seen being pulled along the hills in a small donkey cart, wearing a bonnet, bundled in blankets, and smiling, yes, smiling at the fresh Scottish air. There was something deeply paradoxical about it. The Empress of India, ruler of a global empire, sovereign of the most powerful nation on earth, bumping along in a rickety cart led by a humble little donkey named Jacquard. And it wasn't a one-off novelty. She did it regularly. Victoria found solace in nature, especially after Prince Albert's death. She turned increasingly inward, seeking comfort in simple routines and quiet landscapes. The donkey cart rides were part of that. They took her away from palaces, away from Parliament, away from being the figurehead of half the globe. For a brief moment, she could pretend she was just a widow in the countryside, enjoying a stroll in the heather. And yet, like everything Victoria did, it became a ritual of power cloaked in simplicity. Even in her most modest moments, she was still surrounded by attendants, recorded in sketchbooks, and followed by rumors. The public may not have seen these rides, but her inner circle understood their importance. They were mental medicine, mood recalibration. She reportedly spoke to the donkeys, too, in German. Perhaps it was nostalgia for her early life. Or perhaps she simply found that donkeys, unlike prime ministers, were reliable and quiet companions. And from miniature carts to miniature ships, our next royal preferred the model-making life, assembling his own tiny navy, while the world expected him to rule an empire. George VI's model ships. Before he was King George VI, before the reluctant speeches, wartime leadership, and burdens of crown, he was Prince Albert, a shy boy, with a stammer, and a love for quiet, meticulous hobbies. Chief among them, building model ships. These weren't store-bought toys. They were precise, historically accurate, often hand-assembled scale replicas. He had a workshop dedicated to the craft, complete with miniature tools, magnifying glasses, and volumes of naval reference material. He spent hours alone, sanding hulls, painting details, adjusting rigging. Why ships? Partly because of his naval service. George served in the Royal Navy during World War I and had a lifelong connection to the sea. But also because the process offered control, order, and calm things he rarely enjoyed in public life. Each ship was a world he could understand, a task with a beginning, middle, and end. Unlike public speaking, which terrified him, or court appearances, which exhausted him, shipbuilding was silent achievement. No cameras, no crowds, just wood, glue, and patience. His models weren't just for fun. He kept many of them in his personal study and gave some as gifts. Visitors were often surprised to see a king surrounded not by weapons or oil portraits, but by intricately crafted ships in glass cases, as if they were floating mid-ocean in a bottle of air. The hobby didn't disappear when he became king. If anything, it became more important. During the chaos of World War II, George VI would sometimes retreat to his models, seeking sanctuary in scaled-down serenity, while the real Royal Navy fought for survival on actual seas. And speaking of pieces put carefully together, let's move on to the Queen who could stare at one image for hours. Elizabeth II, puzzle master of Sandringham. Elizabeth II's jigsaw puzzles. In between diplomatic visits, military briefings, and state banquets, Queen Elizabeth II had a peculiar pastime: jigsaw puzzles. Not glamorous, not headline-worthy, but deeply, passionately pursued. She was, by all accounts, obsessed, especially during holidays at Sandringham or Balmoral, where a large, half-completed puzzle often occupied a dedicated table for days at a time. Staff were instructed not to touch it. The corgis were steered around it. Guests learned that if the Queen invited you to join her at the puzzle table, you sat down and helped. Politely, quietly. Don't lose a corner piece. Her favorite types were the old-fashioned kind, thousands of tiny pieces with minimal hints on the box, often of pastoral scenes or obscure royal palaces. The more difficult, the better. She didn't want distraction. She wanted challenge. The Queen loved the feeling of progress, of creating order out of chaos, a single piece clicking into place. That miniature triumph, repeated over and over, until an image emerged. It's almost poetic, the monarch whose job was to hold a fragmented country together, relaxing by aligning fragments of cardboard. And she was good at it, lightning fast at borders, a knack for spotting odd shapes, a steel trap memory for color gradations. Her staff claimed she could complete a 1,000-piece puzzle in a few sittings when uninterrupted. It was her form of meditation. While other heads of state vacationed in yachts or ski chalets, Elizabeth huddled over jigsaws, sipping tea, occasionally chuckling when a guest tried to force a mismatched piece. From cardboard kingdoms to royal nicknames, we now turn to Edward VII once more, and the stomach that launched 1,000 jokes. Introducing Tum Tum. Edward VII's nickname, Tum Tum. For a man who spent much of his life fighting public criticism, Edward VII managed to endure one nickname that was as affectionate as it was cutting: Tum Tum. And yes, it referred exactly to what you think it did: his belly. Edward, even as Prince of Wales, was known for his large appetite, sedentary habits, and fondness for rich food. Roast meats, cream-heavy sauces, fine wines, multi-course banquets, all regularly consumed, often more than once a day. He wasn't just overweight. He was positively round by Victorian standards. His waistline famously expanded to the point where custom-made chairs and special corsets were commissioned just to keep up. His family noticed, the palace noticed, even Queen Victoria, a woman not known for light-hearted banter, referred to him as Tum Tum in letters. It wasn't said with cruelty, more a tone of weary resignation, as if his size was just another one of Bertie's little indulgences, like gambling or flirting or avoiding responsibility. The name stuck. Courtiers whispered it. Servants joked about it. And to his credit, Edward didn't seem to mind. If anything, he leaned into it. He dressed well, carried himself with surprising grace, and turned his girth into part of his brand, the bon vivant prince who laughed, ate, smoked, and lived well. And when he finally became king, he surprised everyone by reigning with dignity, diplomacy, and an unexpectedly keen political mind. Tum Tum may have waddled into the throne room, but he ruled it with confidence. And from one royal indulgence to another, next we turn to Henry VIII, once again, who, when not rewriting the country's religion, was busy folding paper into heart-shaped love notes. Henry VIII's love letters. Before he became the thunderous, wife-divorcing monarch we all remember, Henry VIII was, believe it or not, a man in love, deeply, dramatically, obsessively in love. And nothing captures that early side of him better than the love letters he wrote to Anne Boleyn, some of which he folded into the shape of hearts. These weren't quick scribbles or dry political matchmaker notes. They were long, poetic, occasionally desperate, and unironically romantic. Henry poured out his feelings in careful Latin and French, quoting classical lovers, swearing devotion, and making elaborate promises. He wasn't just trying to seduce Anne, he was trying to impress her, to win her mind as well as her hand, or at the very least, her attention. The letters reveal a very different Henry, vulnerable, frustrated, and, at times, almost insecure. He apologized for delays, begged for reassurances, and included coded phrases to avoid scandal in case the messages were intercepted. There's even a hint of emotional manipulation in some, the kind that says, "Without you, I cannot live," while also being the king who could imprison people at will. Romantic, right? The physical letters still exist, preserved in the Vatican Library. Yes, the Vatican, because somehow the Pope's people ended up with the private love notes Henry wrote to the woman he would later defy Rome to marry. The irony practically glows on the page. And the folded hearts? A flourish of courtly love, echoing medieval traditions. A king, folding parchment into a symbol, and sending it secretly down palace halls, a ruler reduced to a teenage lover, nervously waiting for a reply. But from passionate parchment to passion for pearls, Elizabeth I took adornment to an entirely different level, thousands of pearls sewn into her gowns and woven into her legend. Elizabeth I, Pearl Addiction. If power had a texture during the Elizabethan era, it would be pearls, cool, smooth, luminous, and in Queen Elizabeth I's case, absolutely everywhere. Her obsession with pearls wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a political strategy, a visual language, a white, shimmering armor. In portraits, she is practically drenched in them, strands looped around her neck, embedded in bodices, dangling from earrings, stitched into gloves and shoes. Gowns carried hundreds, sometimes thousands of individual pearls, all carefully placed to catch candlelight and admiration. Why pearls? Because they symbolized purity, and Elizabeth, the so-called Virgin Queen, leaned hard into that branding. By adorning herself in pearls, she visually reinforced her status as untouchable, unowned, and unearthly. She became part myth, part monarch, wrapped in layers of strategic opulence. And they weren't cheap. Pearls were among the most expensive gems of the time. They came from the Persian Gulf, Sri Lanka, and other distant waters, passed through traders, nobles, and royal gift exchanges. Elizabeth collected them obsessively, often refusing to return borrowed sets and demanding more from suitors and allies as tribute. To give Elizabeth pearls was to pledge loyalty. Some historians estimate that she owned over 3,000 distinct pieces containing pearls by the end of her reign. And no, she didn't repeat outfits. Even in old age, when her real teeth had blackened and her skin had withered under layers of white lead, Elizabeth continued to wear the pearls, because the illusion had to remain intact. She was eternal, ageless, invincible, or so the pearls said. And while Elizabeth used pearls to enchant her subjects, her descendant George IV tried something a little taller, a royal pet giraffe, with more neck than political tact. George IV's pet giraffe. In 1827, George IV received one of the most bizarre and attention-grabbing gifts in royal history, a giraffe shipped all the way from Egypt. It was 7 feet tall, had enormous blinking eyes, and absolutely no business being in London. But for George, who loved spectacle more than sensibility, it was perfect. The giraffe was a diplomatic gift from Muhammad Ali of Egypt. No, not the boxer, the other one. And it instantly became a national sensation. George, already known for his exotic tastes, see Brighton Pavilion, gold-threaded waistcoats, and excessive breakfasts, was over the moon. He had the giraffe housed at the Royal Menagerie in Windsor. where curious nobles and bemused servants gawked at it daily. Special accommodations had to be made. Giraffes don't exactly blend into English architecture, and feeding one meant importing a steady supply of acacia and other non-British flora. It didn't do much, mostly stood around, blinked, and got cold, but it looked majestic, which was good enough for George. Artists painted it, poets wrote about it. London society became giraffe mad, with giraffe-themed hats, giraffe fabrics, and even giraffe-shaped pastries. It was the animal equivalent of a royal fashion trend. And like many of George's whims, it wasn't particularly sustainable. The giraffe didn't live long, unable to adapt to the wet, chilly English climate. But for a moment, it was the centerpiece of royal eccentricity, a living proof of the king's connections, his flair for drama, and his relentless pursuit of novelty. From exotic animals to even more exotic beverages, we now return to Elizabeth II, who, over her reign, received thousands of bottles of Scotch whiskey, most of which she never even opened. Elizabeth II's Scotch collection. While Queen Elizabeth II was never known to be a heavy drinker, she did possess what may be one of the largest private whiskey collections in the UK, entirely by accident. Over her 70-year reign, she received thousands of bottles of Scotch whiskey as official gifts, diplomatic offerings, and ceremonial tributes. Every state visit, royal tour, or Highland Games appearance brought a new bottle, sometimes aged, sometimes rare, sometimes hilariously mediocre, but always respectfully presented in velvet boxes, tartan wraps, or engraved crystal decanters. Distilleries across Scotland practically competed to send her their finest and flashiest single malts. It wasn't because she drank them all. In fact, the Queen was famously moderate. Her daily drink, if any, was a modest gin and Dubonnet, hardly the stuff of pub legends. But Scotch? That was a symbol, especially in Scotland, where it represented national pride, craft, and tradition. Rather than consume the collection, Elizabeth quietly stored it. Some bottles were placed in royal archives, others locked away in cellars at Balmoral and Windsor. Over time, it became a liquid museum, tracing the Queen's travels and engagements through carefully aged casks. Palace staff joked about it. One former footman recalled opening a cabinet and finding over 50 untouched bottles from a single tour of the Highlands. Another remembered delivering a diplomatic gift from Japan, only to find it added to a growing shelf labeled "Spirits, received not to be drunk." Despite the volume, she respected the gesture. She'd thank each giver, smile, and sometimes hold the bottle aloft for photographers. But mostly, she just kept them. Because while Elizabeth may not have downed every dram, she understood that whiskey, like monarchy, is mostly about presentation. And from unopened bottles to unopened fortunes, we next visit Mary I, whose vice wasn't drink but dice. Let's roll into her surprising hobby, gambling. Mary I's hobby of gambling. Of all the Tudor monarchs, Mary I is probably the least associated with fun. Nicknamed Bloody Mary by later Protestants, she tends to be cast as dour, tragic, and fiercely pious. But beneath the political shadows and religious storms, young Mary once had a hobby that surprised even her closest attendants. She loved to gamble. As a teenager, long before the throne and the tragic reign, Mary enjoyed dice games, card tables, and occasional wagers on tournaments or races. In letters and expense accounts, there are references to her playing games like Primero, a forerunner of poker, and Hazard, a dice game popular among the Tudor nobility. She wasn't always a high roller, but she played often. Gambling, at the time, wasn't necessarily frowned upon. It was woven into court life, part of leisure and diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors often played with royals as a gesture of goodwill. But what made Mary's interest stand out was her intensity. She didn't just play to pass time, she played to win. Accounts record small but regular losses, silver coins here, a ring there, a debt forgiven for a clever play, and always with a level of concentration that shocked those used to her otherwise demure public persona. When Mary gambled, she was animated, focused, smiling. It was a version of her that history mostly forgot. Of course, once she ascended the throne, the gaming table was replaced by the council table and the dice replaced with religious decrees. But the echoes of her earlier life remain, hidden in dusty ledgers and offhand mentions from ambassadors. And from dice games in velvet halls, we moved to Velvet Paws, Charles II's royal spaniels, who were so beloved they got a breed named after them, and sometimes a spot in the royal bed. Charles II's love of spaniels in bed. In the sprawling chaos of Charles II's court, where politics blurred with partying, and every corridor whispered with scandal, there was one constant: dogs. Specifically, small, floppy-eared spaniels that trailed him like furry shadows, and occasionally, according to several sources, shared his royal bed. These weren't just lapdogs, they were companions, confidantes, mood lifters, and an essential part of Charles's entourage. They wandered freely around court, curled up on velvet cushions, attended royal dinners, and reportedly sat in council meetings as if deciding the fate of Europe. Most of them belonged to a small, specific breed that would eventually be named after him, the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. They were adored, pampered, sometimes perfumed. Palace staff knew to make room for them, and courtiers learned quickly that ignoring one or worse, stepping on a paw could cost them royal favor. The dogs slept wherever they pleased, and yes, that included Charles's bed, where at least a few of them were said to nestle in at night, like furry sentries guarding the king's dreams. It may sound eccentric, but Charles's affection for dogs wasn't a quirk, it was a counterbalance. The court was full of sycophants, spies, and ambitious ladder climbers. The dogs didn't care about politics. They offered unconditional companionship. That kind of loyalty was rare. And in a life defined by instability, exile, civil war, betrayal, Charles found comfort in the simplicity of animals. No backstabbing, no demands, just wagging tails and warm feet. From warm beds and royal dogs, we now turn to a queen who believed in the power of scent, not just on her skin, but in her letters. Prepare yourself for perfumed dispatches from Queen Victoria. Victoria's perfumed letters. Queen Victoria, the widow queen draped in black, was not always the symbol of mourning and propriety that history paints her to be. Once, she was a passionate young woman who wrote *** letters steeped in emotion and often in perfume. To Prince Albert, her beloved husband and consort, Victoria wrote constantly. Their correspondence was a mix of romantic declarations, political updates, and intimate musings. But what made her letters stand out even more than their frequency or flourish was that she often scented them with her personal perfume before sealing them. Imagine receiving a royal letter, ink still fresh, the Queen's script looping with practiced elegance, and a faint but unmistakable scent wafting from the parchment. It wasn't random. Victoria wanted Albert to experience her presence, to breathe her in, even when miles apart. It was a surprisingly sensual detail from a queen so often portrayed as cold or detached. This wasn't just a youthful indulgence either. Victoria continued the habit of scented stationery throughout her life. Certain letters to her children, to trusted friends, or to heads of state bore the same subtle fragrance. Her favorite scents were floral, particularly orange blossom and violet, sometimes mixed with musk or lavender. Perfume, for her, was memory made liquid. When Albert died, the perfumed letters stopped. In their place came black-edged paper, more formal tone, and no scent at all. It was as if the fragrance had died with him. But those earlier letters remained preserved, some still faintly scented. A queen who ruled over millions, whispering in ink, pressing her essence into every page. And now, from sweet smells to musical bells, we descend into one of George III's stranger fascinations. A clock that didn't just chime, it talked. George III's talking clock. George III has long been remembered for his bouts of mental illness, but behind the erratic behavior was a man of deep curiosity, especially when it came to gadgets. One of his more curious possessions? A talking clock. Yes, a mechanical timepiece that didn't just chime, it spoke. Or, more accurately, it played pre-recorded musical phrases and vocal announcements using a system of pipes, bells, and gears. This wasn't just a novelty. It was a serious piece of engineering for its time, blending horology with early audio gimmickry. And George loved it. He kept it in a private study at Windsor, where it would chime the hours in tune and announce things like the time, or even in some later models, reminders or greetings. Though some considered it eerie, George found the musical clock calming, even mesmerizing. It offered predictability, rhythm, and structure, something that may have brought comfort during his more unstable periods. His interest in clocks went far beyond novelty. George III was a mechanical enthusiast. He collected timepieces, tinkered with gears, and frequently consulted with clockmakers and engineers. Some accounts say he would disappear for hours, staring into clock mechanisms, fascinated by their ticking perfection. The talking clock, which may have had origins in German or Swiss design, became one of his favorites. Its melodic chimes echoed through the palace, marking time not just in hours, but in moods. A little celebration at noon, a slow, reflective melody at dusk. To most, it was an eccentricity, but to George, it was a companion, one that never interrupted, never judged, and always kept perfect time. Now, from a king whose clock could speak, we end with a queen who broke every royal rule by appearing on screen, parachuting into fiction, and stealing the show in the most unlikely spy movie cameo ever made. Elizabeth II's 007 moment. It was the London 2012 Olympic Games, and the opening ceremony was packed with British pride, pop culture, and pomp. But no one, absolutely no one, expected Queen Elizabeth II to appear alongside James Bond, and certainly not to parachute into the stadium. Well, sort of. In the now iconic pre-recorded sketch, Daniel Craig's James Bond enters Buckingham Palace, where the Queen, not a double, not an actress, but her actual majesty greets him, deadpan and poised. She then accompanies him to a helicopter, flies over London, and, in the stunt portion played by professionals, parachutes into the stadium. The crowd erupted. The world gaped. The Queen, at 86, had just delivered one of the coolest cameos in cinematic history. It was a masterstroke of humor, timing, and national branding. Elizabeth had always understood the power of symbolism, and here, she reinvented herself again, not as a staid monarch, but as a pop icon. By aligning herself with Bond, she reminded the world that Britain's soft power came not just from history, but from cultural myth-making. What made it work? The Queen's unshakable stoicism. She played it completely straight. No winks, no smirks. That made it funny and deeply British. She didn't have to be funny. She just had to exist in the joke with utter sincerity. It became one of the most beloved moments of her reign, especially among younger generations who saw, perhaps for the first time, a queen who got the joke and was in on it. So ends our long, winding journey through royal quirks, eccentricities, and utterly human oddities. They ruled empires, but lived with Tupperware, squirrels, and musical clocks. Behind every crown was a person, and behind every person, a secret hobby, a soft spot, or a sandwich hidden in a handbag.